Section 1. Welcome and Introduction.
Welcome to the Sutton Hoo Audio Guide. My name is Chris, and I will be joining you as we go around this special place where one of the most important archaeological discoveries in history was made. We will be exploring a number of areas around the Sutton Hoo property, telling the stories of the people and events that opened our minds to the Anglo-Saxons, their way of life and their way of death, lifting the veil on what previously had been termed the Dark Ages. The audio guide is divided into a number of sections, one for each of the places we visit. At each, we will meet one of our volunteer guides, who will then tell us the stories relating to that place. We will start in the Courtyard, where you entered the property. We'll visit Tranmer House to hear about the discovery of the ship and the people involved in it. We will visit the Royal Burial Ground to hear more about the history. And then we'll go to our main exhibition in the High Hall to learn about Anglo-Saxon life, told through many of the objects found in the royal grave. Our focus will be on the discovery of the great Anglo-Saxon ship and the burial of a great king within it, events that took place during the early part of the 7th century. This burial contained a huge number of truly remarkable grave goods of unsurpassed quality and beauty. Although the original objects from the ship burial are in the British Museum, we have beautifully made replicas to illustrate the richness of this king's life. It is this story of the discovery and the way it has enriched our knowledge of the Anglo-Saxons that we want to share with you today. We could only ever tell you part of the story of Sutton Hoo in one audio guide, so please do ask our volunteer guides around the site if you have questions or want to know more. Now here is a list of the sections within our audio guide, so you'll know what to expect.
Section 1. Welcome and Introduction. Section 2. The Courtyard and the Ship Sculpture. Section 3. Tranmer House. Section 4. The Walk to the Burial Ground. Section 5. The Royal Burial Ground. Sections 6 to 10. The High Hall Exhibition.
And now let's get started on our tour. Keep listening and we will move to the next section in the Courtyard.
Section 2. The Courtyard and Ship Sculpture.
The National Trust property at Sutton Hoo is on part of an estate developed in the Victorian and Edwardian era. But actually, this land has been used by humans throughout history, from the Stone Age, through the Bronze and Iron Ages, through Roman, Anglo-Saxon and medieval times, right up to the present day. But first let's get our bearings. Our starting point is the Visitor Welcome Building, where you picked up this audio guide. Exiting this building, you come to the side of, and near corner of, a large rectangular courtyard about 50 metres by 20 metres, with a bonded gravel surface. In front of you, on the opposite side of the courtyard, is a large single-storey building containing the cafe, shop and toilets. Further away to the right is the aptly named High Hall. That is our main exhibition space, and we will explore it later. To your left are some of the original estate buildings, the last of which is the old squash court, now our second-hand bookshop. In the centre is a raised grey plinth, 27 metres long, running to your left, and 8.5 metres wide, on which is mounted the impressive ship sculpture. The plinth has raised sensory markers near its edges in the form of metal strips at 40 centimetres and metal studs at 10 centimetres from all edges. Now let's meet Tony, our first guide, who will tell us more. Hello Tony, can you start by explaining why this land has been so important to people?
Hello Chris, and welcome to the Courtyard. Let's start by considering the landscape around us here. This is high ground with promontories called Hoos, overlooking the River Deben. You'll be going out onto these Hoos during your time here, so should get a better feel for them. It's an area that's been valued by the people of this region throughout history for a variety of reasons, for hunting, for raising animals and crops, probably as an important meeting place, and for their rituals surrounding death. If we can imagine going back to the Anglo-Saxon period, before a road and a bridge over the river were built, the way into this landscape was from the river and up the valleys to these Hoos. This was a time without maps or boundaries, so what better place to memorialise your princes and kings than by burying them in mounds to be seen by all, and to make a clear statement to visitors that they were entering the realm of a powerful chieftain or king. It was in one of these mounds that a great Anglo-Saxon king was buried within the great ship. The grave rested undisturbed for 1300 years until 1939, when Edith Pretty, the owner of the estate, and the archaeologist Basil Brown rediscovered it just before the outbreak of the Second World War.
Thanks, Tony. That's mentioned the ship and brings us to the sculpture, which is a major feature of this space. So can you describe it to us and tell us its significance?
You have entered Sutton Hoo today into this courtyard, and in front of you is a full-size sculpture representing the great Anglo-Saxon ship. It is 27 metres long from stem to stern and 4.5 metres wide amidships, tapering to a point at both bow and stern. Not a boat as such, but just the ribs of a ship, arching upwards from its keel towards the sky, invoking the ghostly shape that was unearthed during the excavation in 1939. For that's all there was, just an impression of it left in the sandy soil. Our sculpture is made from rusted steel, although the original ship was constructed of oak. There is no planking on the sides of the ship's sculpture, as none was found in the grave, just a discoloration in the sand where once there had been inch-thick oak planks. There are 26 ribs running from stern to stem, curving up from each side of the keel at the base, representing the transverse frames of the ship. The photographs of the excavation, on display in Tranmer House, show these frames very clearly, even though they were just shapes in the sand. The keel, resting on the plinth, is straight at its central part, but curves up at each end to form the stem and stern posts, reaching up above our heads to a height of 4 metres. When the ship was entombed in the burial mound, these posts would have remained above ground and would have been visible from a long distance away, and importantly from the river below. The sheer size and scale may help us to imagine the effect such a monumental statement of power would have had on the people of the time when arriving from the River Deben. The acid soil at Sutton Hoo has robbed us of any of the ship's timbers, but with imagination we can create our own image of the ship from this ghost ship sculpture. The other feature is a raised rectangular stone-faced block in the centre of the sculpture. It's some 6.5 metres long, 3 metres wide and 0.7 metres high, representing the burial chamber as it was discovered in 1939. The burial chamber was built in the centre of the ship of timber and probably with a pitched roof. It contained the body of the king, his helmet, sword, shield and other weapons, his chainmail, belts, buckles and clothing, his feasting dishes and drinking vessels, and lots more. Over time, the chamber collapsed from the weight of the earth on top, and everything was compressed into the bottom of the ship, as depicted here. Some of the grave objects discovered are illustrated on the surface, displayed in relief in the positions that they were found.
Thank you very much, Tony. We invite you to explore further, but do take care as the raised plinth the sculpture is mounted on has an uneven step height around it. There are also some information panels mounted on this plinth, and usually there will be a volunteer guide in the courtyard who can assist you, answer your questions and tell you more. At the far end of the sculpture, away from the entrance, there is an interpretation point with a relief plan of the site, together with an introduction to Sutton Hoo and a navigation guide in both large text and braille. This may be useful to get your bearings on the site. To find this, go down to the far end of the sculpture, away from the visitor entrance, and then, with your back to the sculpture, find the metre-high open metal frame with the information on its top surface. This is a good starting point for getting to our next section. From the information point at the end of the ship sculpture, there is a path that leads to Tranmer House. The bonded resin of the courtyard will change to compacted earth and then to a tarmac path leading round the right-hand side of the house to the front door. Do take care as the ground can be uneven in places. Now you have a choice. You can either pause the player until you reach the front of Tranmer House and then listen to its history before entering, or continue to listen on your journey, which will take about 5 minutes. Which you choose may depend on the weather. This is an exposed site and you may not want to linger outside the house for longer than necessary. However, if the weather is fair, there are some chairs and picnic tables in the front of the house which would be a good place to perch while you listen to the first story in our Tranmer House section.
Section 3, Tranmer House.
The stories in this section are about the house, Edith and Frank Pretty, Basil Brown, and the discovery of the ship. The first of our stories in this section is about the house itself and lasts about 5 minutes. If you are listening to it on your way over to the house, please do take a moment to take in the landscape in front of it before going inside. We are on an open plateau of grass and ferns with a number of tall pine trees looking over a shallow valley towards the river some 800 metres away. Even today the river is often full of boats. The market town of Woodbridge nestles between trees on the other side of the river. The house is about 30 metres above the river level, and the ground falls away to a wide valley in front of us. This is an area we call Rabbit Field, where you might see some rare breeds of sheep, and yes, rather a lot of rabbits who like the sandy soil here. A good place to take in this landscape and to listen to this guide is at one of the picnic tables on the grass opposite the entrance and overlooking that river, or if the weather is inclement, go inside and find a seat there. Within the house, we'll tell you about the people and events around the 1939 discovery. There is seating within each of the rooms, so please make use of this while listening to our stories. We have now arrived outside the front of Tranmer House, which is built near the edge of one of the Hoos, looking out towards the River Deben below us. The royal burial ground is just across the valley, to the left, on the next Hoo, and we'll be learning a lot more about that a bit later. Now let's meet Leslie, our next guide. Hello Leslie, would you tell us about the house and the people who lived here?
Hello and welcome to Tranmer House. This was the home of Edith Pretty and her son Robert when the great ship was discovered in 1939. But the house and estate have had several owners and quite an eventful history. The house itself, originally known as Sutton Hoo House, was built in 1910 for John Chadwick Lomax, who was an artist and a gentleman of independent means. It was designed by John Sherwell Corder, a local architect from Ipswich, and originally it had around 18 bedrooms. As well as being a private family residence, it was also used to host shooting parties on the estate. Corder's design is an expressive mix of architectural styles, as is its accompanying complex of stables and squash court that you passed as you came across to the house. There are traditional English manor house elements, such as the Tudor Revival front door and solid wood panelling inside, but it was also built with modern conveniences of central heating and electric lighting throughout. John Lomax only lived in his new house for a few years before his death in 1916, and for the next decade the house was let to various tenants. It was in 1926 that the house and estate were bought by Edith for £15,250 after her marriage to Frank Pretty, opening perhaps the most dramatic period of events here, the birth of her son, the death of her husband, and the discovery of the great ship burial. Edith lived here until the early war years, but died in 1942 when the house passed to her young son, who was only 12 at the time. He went to live with Edith's sister in Hampshire, and the house was requisitioned by the War Office for the war effort. During that time, 60 Land Army girls were billeted here, and I'm afraid to say they left their mark on the property in the form of graffiti on the fireplace, and small holes in the panelling where their darts missed the dartboard. Do ask the guides in the house to point these out if you're interested.
Yes, there are lots of names scratched into the fireplace there, and a heart pierced by an arrow. They are echoes from the recent past, and I wonder what their stories were. We'll probably never know. So what happened to the house after the war?
In the late 1940s, the estate was bought by the Barton family. They were dairy farmers and raised prize-winning Frisian cows here. It was during the Bartons' time that one of the upper wings of the house was removed, it is believed to reduce the cost of heating. The last private occupants of the house were the Tranmer family, who bought it and the estate in 1972. Then, in 1998, after Annie Tranmer's death, the trustees of the Annie Tranmer Trust kindly donated the house and estate to the National Trust, and Sutton Hoo House was renamed Tranmer House in her honour. It has been open to the public since 2010. The upper stories of the house now contain 3 National Trust holiday flats.
Thanks, Leslie. Now let's go towards the front door of the house, which will be our way in, and which is approached across a circular area of tarmac with a large stone urn in the centre. This was the driveway to the house which the chauffeur would have used to deliver occupants to their front door. Now entering through the front door, we come into a small hallway, some 3 metres wide and 5 metres deep, where you'll hear some period 1930s music playing. On the left is a large sideboard that belonged to Edith Pretty, one of the few original objects that we have from her time here. And on it are a wind-up gramophone and a telephone, both of the period, and which would have been in the house during Edith's time. On the right-hand side is a black and white photograph of the Tranmers, who were the last private owners of the house and estate. Just past this photograph is the door into the main rooms of the house. Come with us through this door into the drawing room. This is the first of 3 rooms that tell both the story of the excavations that have taken place at Sutton Hoo and of the people involved, from Edith Pretty and Basil Brown, who discovered the ship, to the present-day archaeologists and curators who continue to look after the site and the amazing objects unearthed here. But the first thing you'll notice is there's a lot going on here with a number of audio-visual displays around the room. So let's just get our bearings. The drawing room is 10 metres long by 7 metres wide, with a large bay window to your right, and it is panelled in rich dark hardwood from floor to ceiling. On the opposite wall is the stone fireplace we mentioned previously with its graffiti. Above it are displayed newspapers and newsreel images of this period going into the Second World War. To the left of the fireplace is a corridor going away from us, with doors to the dining room on the left and to the sitting room on the right. We will visit both of these. The corridor continues to some French doors and a veranda, and this will be our exit when we have finished here, unless it is too windy, in which case we will exit by the front door. Immediately on your right as you enter the drawing room are black and white photographs of our main protagonists, Edith Pretty, standing with arms folded, and the archaeologist Basil Brown in tweed coat and flat cap. We'll tell you lots more about them shortly. Where shall we go first, Leslie?
To start with, come round to the left of the door where we entered. On the wall here is a half-length portrait of Edith Pretty in a gilt frame. It's about 1 metre high and 0.8 of a metre wide, and shows her at the age of 56, seated facing slightly to her right, wearing a blue silk evening dress and pearls. She looks straight out of the frame from a slightly sad but strong and determined face. Her hands are crossed in front, resting in her lap. There is a companion painting further to the left on the adjacent wall of her son Robert at the age of 8. Of a similar size and again in a gilt frame, this charming 3/4 length portrait of young Robert, with rosy cheeks and auburn hair. Wearing a blue shirt and grey trousers, he looks straight out at us and carries a model yacht named Swallow in his right arm. One could say that his expression is slightly cheeky, which seems probably exactly right. Both these pictures were painted in 1939, the year of the great ship discovery, by the Dutch painter Corvaiseur, who lived and painted in Suffolk for many years.
Yes, they're really lovely portraits. Now there is some convenient seating here below Edith's portrait, which you're welcome to use while you listen to the next couple of items. OK, Leslie, I think we now need to hear about Edith Pretty, because without Edith we may never have known about Sutton Hoo. So please tell us about her.
Edith was an amazing lady, achieving so much in the male-dominated world of the time, and I think you can see some of that strength of character in the portrait. Edith was born in Yorkshire in 1883, the second daughter of Elizabeth and Robert Dempster. Her father, Robert, was a wealthy industrialist who made his fortune from the company R&J Dempster and Sons, founded with his brother John, and which supplied equipment to the gas industry. He and his family travelled extensively at a time when it was not common to do so, visiting many archaeological sites, including Egypt, Pompeii and Greece. Edith was educated at Rodin School and finished in 1901 by spending 6 months in Paris to polish her French. Following that, the family embarked on a world tour that took almost a year. The family moved to Vale Royal in Cheshire in 1907, and Edith became a magistrate and was also involved in various charitable works. Edith had become acquainted with archaeological digs early in her life through the family travels, and this increased when her father excavated a Cistercian abbey adjoining their home at Vale Royal. We now move on to the First World War, during which Edith worked as a quartermaster with the Red Cross in this country, helped with the housing of Belgian refugees, and also served in 1917 with the French Red Cross in France. Edith's mother died in 1919, after which she took care of her father until his death in 1925. At this point, Edith and her sister inherited a considerable fortune of around £500,000. That would be the equivalent to around 32 million today. Now we come to Frank Pretty, her future husband. Frank was from Ipswich and was the brother of one of Edith's close school friends, and that, we understand, is how they came to know each other. He was by now the owner of a family corsetry and millinery factory in Ipswich. Frank actually proposed to Edith when she turned 18 in 1901, and then, reputedly, on every birthday after that, but Edith did not accept his proposal until after her father had died. Edith married Frank Pretty in April 1926 in a society wedding in Cheshire and moved to Ipswich. She bought the Sutton Hoo estate later that year. 4 years after they married, at the age of 47, Edith gave birth to a son who they named Robert. Her health had suffered during the pregnancy, and she continued to suffer health issues for the rest of her life. Tragically, just 4 years after this, in 1934, Frank Pretty died from stomach cancer at the age of only 56, leaving Edith to raise their son alone. There is a set of photographs below young Robert's portrait showing Edith and Frank in happier times.
Thank you, Leslie. Now we have some more to tell you about Frank Pretty coming up in a moment. Now, Frank Pretty may be seen as a minor character in the Sutton Hoo story, but without him, Edith would not have come down to Suffolk, and the great ship may not have been found. So, Leslie, what do we know about him?
Well, you're absolutely right, and even though their marriage was tragically short, it was a happy one, we understand. Frank was an Ipswich man, born in 1878, educated at the Lees, a Methodist school in Cambridge, and subsequently became a director of the family corsetry business, William Pretty and Sons, founded by his grandfather in 1820. It was a successful company based in Ipswich, evolving with the times, moving from corsets to silk underwear by the 1930s. Frank was a keen sportsman when young, becoming a champion skater at the age of 14, and in adult life he rode with the Essex and Suffolk Hounds, his father being huntmaster from 1912 to 1918. In 1901, Frank followed his father into the local Army Volunteers, which later became the Suffolk Territorial Army, or TA. He was promoted to captain in 1902 and to major in 1912. We now have to move to the First World War and introduce another character into the story, namely Polly Hopkins, Frank's horse, which he used for hacking and hunting. At the outbreak of hostilities in 1914, the Suffolk TA was absorbed into the Suffolk Regiment, and they were shipped to France later that year. Frank took his mount Polly Hopkins with him, and they served together throughout the war, both being injured, Polly 3 times, but both recovering. Frank was mentioned in dispatches by Field Marshal Haig, and after the war served with Polly Hopkins in the Army of Occupation on the Rhine for a time. Frank and Polly Hopkins returned to Suffolk, Polly being one of the war horses to survive. He continued in the TA, achieving the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. Polly Hopkins continued to serve Frank faithfully for another 10 years and was stabled at Sutton Hoo when Frank and Edith moved here. Edith also rode, and there is a photograph in the drawing room showing both of them on horseback. In May 1934, Frank fell ill and was diagnosed with stomach cancer. He was never told of his condition, and when the doctors could do no more, Edith turned to spiritualism to try and effect a cure. Frank had some brief remission but died on the 28th of December 1934 on his 56th birthday. Through this sad time, Edith's elder sister visited Sutton Hoo several times to support the family and particularly young Robert, who was only 3 at the time. Although very sad, this was the background to the most momentous stage of the Sutton Hoo story, which was the discovery of the great Anglo-Saxon ship.
Okay, Leslie, so you've told us about Edith and Frank Pretty and have whetted our appetites to hear about the discovery itself. So where do we start?
Well, I'll give you the background to the original pre-war excavations here, but your tour out to the Royal Burial Grounds will fill in a lot more of the detail and tell you about the later excavations during which more was discovered. Edith had known about the mounds on her land when she moved here. She could see them from her sitting room, and a few years after Frank's death she decided to investigate them. Perhaps it was the trips up the Nile with her family, watching excavations there, but Edith wanted the mounds to be investigated properly and sought advice from Charles Maynard of the Ipswich Museum, who recommended self-taught archaeologist and Suffolk-born local man Basil Brown. In the summer of 1938, Edith employed Basil Brown to excavate the mounds on her land and provided 2 members of her staff to help him. She paid him 30 shillings a week and let him stay in a room in her chauffeur's cottage. That summer, they excavated 3 of the mounds, but all had been robbed. In the first 2, some small fragmentary objects were found which indicated Anglo-Saxon burials rather than Bronze Age barrows that might have been expected. In fact, Basil had found a small ship, totally ransacked but identifiable from the scattered iron rivets. He recognised these as being similar to those found in another ship burial up at Snape that had been excavated by antiquarians in the 1880s. To confirm this, Mrs. Pretty's chauffeur drove him up to Aldborough Museum so that he could compare what he had found with an example held in the museum's archives. The following summer, Basil returned, and this time Edith chose what we now call Mound 1 to be investigated. That year, Basil was helped by John Jacobs, Edith Pretty's gardener. They started digging into Mound 1, and it was John Jacobs, the gardener, that found the first pieces of evidence pointing to a ship.
So that was the beginning. What happened next?
Well, Basil started to expose the end of the ship, but soon news got out and reached Charles Phillips of Selwyn College at Cambridge. Charles Phillips was put in overall charge of the excavation from now on, but Edith made sure that Basil continued to be involved. In the event, Basil continued to expose the rest of the 27-metre ship down to where the burial chamber was likely to be. Charles Phillips brought in other archaeologists to work on this area. 2 of these were Peggy Piggott and Stuart Piggott. It was Peggy who found the first of the gold and garnet objects. This was the beginning of little more than 2 weeks' digging, during which 263 items were unearthed, including many exquisite gold and garnet objects. The belt buckle of 14.5 ounces of pure gold, of silver dishes and spoons, and many fragments that would later be identified as from a helmet, shield, sword, and other weapons. We have replicas of many items in the High Hall exhibition, which you will visit later. The Sutton Hoo story is full of really interesting characters, and Basil Brown is most definitely one of them. He is another of those remarkable people for his time. Basil was born in 1888 in Bucklesham, which is just a few miles southwest of here across the river. But his parents soon moved to Church Farm near Rickenhall, some 30 miles northwest, where his father was a tenant farmer, a wheelwright and an agent for the Royal Insurance Company. At the age of just 5, Basil studied astronomical texts he'd inherited from his grandfather, and at other times he could be seen digging up fields. Perhaps a sign of things to come? He attended Rickenhall School but left at the age of 12 to work on his father's farm. But clearly he wanted to learn more and attended evening classes to gain a certificate in drawing at the age of 14, which was followed by correspondence courses from which he gained diplomas with distinction in astronomy, geography and geology, all by the age of 19. From textbooks and radio broadcasts, Basil taught himself Latin, Greek, French and some German and Spanish. This was so he could read scientific papers in their original languages. He married in 1923, and he and his wife May lived all their lives in Rickenhall. Now, although we know him as an archaeologist, Basil's interest and studies in astronomy led to the publication in 1932 of his book Astronomical Atlases, Maps and Charts. This was sufficiently popular that it was reprinted in 1968. As I mentioned, from an early age Basil could be seen digging up fields. And once grown up and working on his father's farm, he used his spare time to investigate the Suffolk countryside, looking for Roman remains. His investigations of Roman potteries led in 1934 to the excavation of a Roman kiln at Wattisfield, and this was successfully removed to the Ipswich Museum in 1935. This is how he got to know the Ipswich Museum curator, Guy Maynard, and he then applied to Maynard to work for the museum on a contractual basis. Payment for such work was minimal, at around £1.50 to £2 per week, and Basil had to continue to work as an insurance agent to make ends meet. That, of course, brings us up to the time when he came to work for Edith Pretty at Sutton Hoo in 1938 and 39, and which we cover in other parts of this audio guide. After the war, Basil continued to work for the Ipswich Museum, undertaking numerous excavations around Suffolk, cycling everywhere and preparing copious records. His work between 1946 and 49 included many finds in the Roman villa at Castle Hill in the Witton area of Ipswich. Basil retired from active excavation work in 1965 following a heart attack, but he was still able to visit Sutton Hoo during the Rupert Bruce Mitford re-examination of Mound 1 in his 1967-71 campaign. Basil died of pneumonia in March 1977 at the age of 89. Unlike his astronomical research, he never published anything himself on his archaeological work, this being done by the Ipswich Museum. However, a personal record does exist of the Sutton Hoo excavations in his diaries. Rupert Bruce Mitford, the archaeologist who re-excavated Mound 1 in the 1960s, states that, beside being informative and entertaining, it is a very human and touching document. It makes very good reading. Charles Phillips, who took over the lead of the Sutton Hoo excavation in his book My Life in Archaeology, called Mr. Brown a pure piece of rustic Suffolk. Although his services to archaeology were recognised when he was awarded a civil list pension in 1968, it is not until quite recently that his role in the discovery at Sutton Hoo has been included in museum descriptions.
Wow, that is quite an extraordinary life and achievement for a man of such humble origins. Thank you so much, Leslie, for telling us so much.
You're most welcome, and thank you for visiting Tranmer House.
So let's start from the seat below Edith's portrait. In front and to the left is a console with a small video display where you can hear the voices of Basil Brown, John Jacobs and Charles Phillips again. Right in front of this is a glass case containing one of the ship's rivets from the grave. To the right is another glass case containing Basil Brown's leather measuring tape that he used during his work here. Then we'd like to direct you towards the display unit in the corner to the far right, between the fireplace and the window. Here you will find another audio-visual display. The people you will hear are Peggy Piggott again, here called Margaret Guido after her second marriage, Stuart Piggott talking about the gold buckle, and Charles Phillips again. There is a display illustrating the reconstruction of the helmet from the fragments that were found, and a list of all the finds. There will be one of our volunteer guides in the house who will be pleased to help, answer questions, and tell you more that we can include here. Now let's go down the corridor to the left of the fireplace and go through the door, on the left, into the dining room. This room is 8 metres by 5 metres and is also panelled. To the right is a bay window looking out towards the burial ground. We have positioned 2 large screens on which are projected a sequence of photographs taken during the 1939 excavations. These show the shape of the ghost ship in the sand and the discovery of some of the objects. There are some bench seats in the centre for viewing these screens. We obviously hope that these will be accessible to most of our audio guide listeners, but appreciate that it won't be for all. When you have finished here, retrace your steps back to the corridor and cross it into the sitting room. This is a very elegant, light-filled room, 7 metres by 5 metres, with a grand marble fireplace to the right and a bay window to the left. This was Edith Pretty's sitting room, and she would have looked out of the bay window and seen the burial mounds on the other side of the valley. This is an opportunity for you to sit down in one of the comfortable chairs and listen to some of the other people who have been or are still involved, exploring, conserving and understanding this very special place. So pause the player now and resume play when you're ready to move on to visit the Royal Burial Ground. Well, now it's time to move on to our next section. Please exit the house, turning right out of the sitting room, and go through the doors at the end of the corridor to the veranda. Follow the hard surface path which will take you towards the Royal Burial Ground. Alternatively, go back through the panelled drawing room to the front door and exit there. Turn left and go round the outside of the house until you pick up the path leading away towards the valley and onto the Royal Burial Ground. Meanwhile, we'll tell you some more about the discovery and the film that was made about it.
Section 4. The Walk to the Burial Ground.
We will now make the short journey from Tranmer House to the Royal Burial Ground, a journey of about 400 metres on a wide gravel path. The standard way to exit Tranmer House is through the main entrance hall where you originally entered the house. Sometimes the glass double doors in the hallway between Mrs. Pretty's sitting room and the dining room will also be open, and the gravel pathway to the Royal Burial Grounds leads straight out from these glass doors. If you exit the house by the main entrance hall, please turn left out of the main door, go round the house with the house on your left, and walk initially on the tarmac drive, then across the grass, still with the house on your left. In this way you will reach the veranda on your left, and the gravel path to the burial grounds leads straight to the right. This gravel path, which is roughly 1 metre wide and is bordered by grass, curves gradually to the left and through a metal gate. Falling gently away to the right of the path is the shallow valley between the 2 Hoos, which leads across scrubland and grass down to the Deben River, close to where the famous ship is believed to have been carried up from the river to the Hoo to its final resting place. On the path, at a junction, some 150 paces from the gate, the path splits. One goes to the right and takes you to a viewing platform between the Hoos, and then onto a grass path down towards the valley, while the left-hand path curves rightwards towards the tree-lined way to the Royal Burial Ground. The junction of the path is marked both by a tall wooden signpost and also by a slate slab in the path, which is engraved with directions, indicating the path to the right. Follow the final journey of the ship from the River Deben to the Royal Burial Ground, about 30 minutes. Indicating the path to the left, the shorter way to the Royal Burial Ground via an accessible route along a flat path, about 15 minutes. Assuming you follow the shorter route to the left, keep following this gravel path. You will pass another path coming from your left, which leads from the exhibition courtyard and ship sculpture. As you enter the trees, you will pass the marvellous and evocative wooden structure, a seat with a tall cowl modelled on the prow of a longship, which is known as the Gar seat. The seat was commissioned by Dick and Lisa Robinson in memory of Elizabeth Robinson, affectionately known as Gar, who was a volunteer at Sutton Hoo until her death in 1997. The tall, ship-shaped cowl, some 5 metres high, surmounts a heavily carved bench, with carvings echoing the Anglo-Saxon designs. You are welcome to take a pause and sit on the bench. Close by you will also pass the curved benches engraved with words "Outdoors were pantry, workshop, playground and temple." Continuing along the path through the trees, you will reach a wooden gate, and immediately beyond this gate, over a sandy path, is a second gate. Occasionally farm vehicles can pass along this sandy path, so please take care. Pass through these gates and you will enter the grassy path which marks the start of the Royal Burial Ground.
Section 5. The Royal Burial Ground.
The stories in this section are about the Royal Burial Ground, starting with Mound 2, Sutton Hoo's other ship burial, then moving to the viewing tower for the story of Mound 1, the Great Ship Burial. Following Mound 1, we will visit and discuss Mound 17, the Horseman's Burial, which was the only other grave we know of that had not been robbed. Finally, we will discuss the discovery of the sand bodies, which takes us into the time of the new Christian religion in this land. We have come from Tranmer House, which is on one Hoo, round the top of the valley, and on to the next Hoo, where the Royal Burial Ground is located. We reach the third and final gate, and this takes us from the sandy track into an open field with the burial ground approximately 100 paces ahead. When you arrive, you will be standing in front of a very large roped-off field, which is the Royal Burial Ground itself, and is some 240 metres long by 120 metres wide. One could describe the area as being a reverse capital D shape, with the straight line of the D on the far right on the edge of the hilltop, or the Hoo. Just over halfway along this straight edge, on the right, is the viewing tower, which overlooks the burial ground. Behind the viewing tower, and rolling down the river valley away from the Hoo, is a grove of trees called Top Hat Wood, and this wood features in the story of the excavation. Once you get to the large sign at the start of the burial ground, you can follow a curving path running clockwise round the mounds, and in due course leading to the viewing tower that was constructed in 2021. Many of the mounds are now quite flat due to long-term erosion and historic agricultural practices, even the Great Burial Mound itself far away to the right. The first mound to the immediate right, however, is Mound 2, and this is significantly larger than the others, but only because permission was granted by the British Museum in the 1980s to rebuild this mound to its presumed original height of between 4 and 5 metres, using spoil taken from around the mound, rather like a circular moat. Some of the mounds are completely flat. For example, the first one to the left of the path, near the signpost, is interpreted to have held a high-status woman, but this mound is not visible at all. Further left, outside of Sutton Hoo's property boundary, is very extensive open farmland, which surrounds the burial ground on its eastern and southern sides. Here we meet the next of our volunteer guides, who is Kevin. Hello, Kevin.
Hello there, and welcome to the Royal Burial Ground. Ahead of you, beyond the boundary rope, are a number of Anglo-Saxon burial mounds, most of which are round in shape and today are no more than 2 meters in height. There are 18 known burial mounds within the Royal Burial Ground. Some of the mounds, for instance mounds 5, 17, and 18, are no longer mounds at all and are flat to the ground. In those cases, the soil that had originally formed the mounds has been removed at some time long ago by ploughing and for other farming practices. The Royal Burial Ground was in use from approximately 575 AD to 650 AD, but there are some later burials of non-royal people marked out by white stones, which we will talk about in our sand bodies section.
Kevin, this is a very open and wild space way above the river. What is it about this place that made it special to the Anglo-Saxons?
This place was special not just to the Anglo-Saxons. The Royal Burial Ground is located on an ancient field that has been used by humans from about 3000 BC. The surrounding land was deforested during the Neolithic period and used from then through the Bronze and Iron Ages for arable and eventually livestock farming. We know that the field was the site of a Bronze Age hilltop village. Fragments of Bronze Age pottery and flint arrowheads have been found here aplenty. When Mound 2 was excavated, post holes from the Bronze Age roundhouse were discovered below the mounds. Its proximity to the river was very important to all those who occupied this site. For a small Bronze Age hilltop village, the site might have offered a defensive element to its location. As a high point above the river, the Anglo-Saxons will have chosen the site as a most suitable location for burial sites to honor the earliest kings of East Anglia. This has also been the way into the landscape. Before roads and bridges were built, people came by boat or along the riverbank up onto the Hoos and into the land beyond. There's an ancient track that came up from the river over this field, still appearing on the earliest maps of the area circa 1601. So with few trees around, these mounds would have been visible to visitors both from the river and the surrounding land. The Deben River lies in the wide valley below us to our right, and nowadays we're approximately 7.5 miles inland from the mouth to the North Sea near Bodsey and Felixstowe. From where we are now heading into the Royal Burial Ground, we are facing south, so the North Sea is a long way to the east on our left. Directly across the river from where we're standing is the town of Woodbridge. Further upriver to the north is Melton and then Bromswell, and 5 or so miles further on we find Rendlesham.
Ah yes, now Rendlesham has been undergoing significant archaeological investigation in recent years, hasn't it? And this has revealed that there was a very large Anglo-Saxon settlement there in the decades before and after King Radwold. Significant amounts of remarkable artefacts have been discovered, including pottery and coins, while the large number of metalwork finds indicates extensive metalworking in bronze and precious metals. The location of the habitations for the ordinary working people have been found, mainly through the discovery of everyday artefacts and the substantial quantities of animal bones, which are the remains of feasting. A few years ago, aerial photography of crop markings suggested the location of a great hall, maybe what we would now call a palace for a king, and that was the subject of an archaeological dig during the summer of 2022.
Yes, and that confirmed that it was indeed a great hall, but likely one of a number of such buildings. Leading archaeologists at the site believed that this great hall could be one of between 4 and 10 such halls on the Rendlesham settlement. So this does confirm that Rendlesham was an extensive, high-status Anglo-Saxon settlement where the earliest kings of East Anglia would have resided from time to time, been seen, held court, and held magnificent feasts for their followers. Historical texts also evidence Rendlesham's royal status. Around 731 AD, the Venerable Bede, a monk in the north of England, wrote an ecclesiastical history of the English people and their churches, a text which has become fundamental to the understanding of early medieval period. In this, he referred to Rendlesham as a royal residence and wrote that it was the largest and richest Anglo-Saxon settlement in England between the 5th and 8th centuries. The archaeological work around Rendlesham during the past few years and the recent finds do support Bede's writings.
That's really interesting. We should never think that archaeology is all done and dusted. We still have a lot to discover. And if you are interested to find out more about the recent discoveries at Rendlesham, please do an internet search on Rendlesham Revealed, and you will find the Suffolk Heritage Explorer website, where there is a lot of information. So Kevin, do tell us more. Do we know any more about the actual people who were here?
Well, Bede wrote about the kingdom of East Anglia. He wrote that East Anglia was first ruled by a family called the Wulfingas. One of the earliest kings was Wulfa, who died in 578. His son, Titla, then ruled until his own death in 599. Wulfa's grandson, Radwold, became king and ruled from 599 until his death in 624 or 625. Bede wrote that from 616, Radwold held sway over all provinces south of the Humber. So based on the writings of Bede and the discoveries made at Rendlesham, it is believed that Rendlesham is where one of the early East Anglian kings, King Radwold, lived and administered his kingdoms. Though we cannot say without any doubt who was buried in the great ship discovered under Mound 1 in 1939, it is a widely held belief and widely accepted by renowned historians that it was King Radwold, King of East Anglia.
Thank you, Kevin.
Mound 2, the other ship burial.
As you say, the mounds do appear to be a variety of shapes and sizes now. Presumably the soft sandy soil around here is easily eroded. Mound 2 really stands out from the others. Can you tell us anything about Mound 2?
Yes, of course. It stands approximately 4 meters in height. There's a substantial ring ditch around the base of the mound. The material from this area would have been used to construct the mound. The diameter of the mound, including the ring ditch, is more than 20 meters. The surface of the mound is today made up of a mixture of gorse, turf, sandy soil, and small stones. The ring ditch itself is today mostly filled with gorse.
It certainly is an impressive sight. Do we know what it contained?
Yes, Mound 2 has been the subject of professional excavations in the 1930s under Basil Brown, and again in the 1980s under Professor Martin Carver. However, when Basil Brown excavated the mound in 1938, he could tell almost immediately that it had been entered and looted in earlier times. The mound was probably first looted at the end of the 16th century. We now know that it was entered again in the 1860s by antiquarians who apparently removed 2 bushels, in other words, 73 liters, of ship's rivets. It's unlikely that this 1860s excavation was known about by Edith Pretty and Basil Brown before they commenced their dig in 1938. It is written that when Basil Brown came to Sutton Hoo in June of 1938, he was surprised by the size of the mounds. When he asked Edith Pretty where he should begin his excavation, she requested that he start with the mound that was the largest mound at the time, Mound 1. Basil, from his observations of Mound 1, worried that the mound may have been entered in the past. Also, he wanted to test his approach to excavating burial mounds on other mounds that were smaller. So he began with Mound 3, which was found to contain a cremation burial, and then on the 6th of July in 1938, Basil began to excavate Mound 2. Ultimately, Basil was hoping to find a burial chamber. By digging a trench through the mound and locating the original ground level, a burial chamber could hopefully be identified by a change in the color and consistency of the sand or soil. Basil began by digging a 6-foot-wide trench into the mound in the east to west direction. Almost immediately, he began to discover lumps of iron. He recognized these as rivets for a ship. So Mound 2 did contain a ship burial, Sutton Hoo's other ship. The rivets found in Mound 2 were scattered throughout the mound in a random fashion, so Basil recognized that Mound 2 had most likely been entered previously and subsequently been robbed. It was common in the late 16th and early 17th centuries that burial mounds, such as found at Sutton Hoo, were robbed of their grave goods. And of all the mounds within the Royal Burial Ground, we believe that only 2 mounds have not been successfully robbed. Basil did discover a burial chamber under Mound 2. It measured approximately 5 meters east to west and 2 meters south to north. Though the mound had been robbed, he found fragments of objects that told him that this was a high-status ship burial. The fragments found included pieces of beautiful blue Anglo-Saxon glass, and no other such glass has been found on site. The terminal of a drinking horn, gilt bronze discs from a shield, iron knives, the tip of a pattern-welded sword, and the stud from a gilded buckle. No body was found within the chamber. The sandy soil at Sutton Hoo is very acidic. Nothing that was organic would have survived unless it was protected by metal, either inside, under, or touching a metal object. Basil finished his excavation of Mound 2 and backfilled the mound as best he could in 1938.
That, of course, could have been the end of the story for Mound 2. It had been robbed out, the ship's structures destroyed, and only a few small artefacts found. But you said it was investigated again. What did that reveal?
Yes, and we have to go on to the 1980s for that. Professor Martin Carver, professor of archaeology at York University, led a research project and a team of archaeologists between the years of 1986 and 1992 within an area of the Royal Burial Ground that included Mound 2. During this project, Mound 2 was re-excavated. Early in the re-excavation of Mound 2, they discovered Robert Pretty's roller skates. These were likely to have been caught up in the backfill when Basil rebuilt the mound in 1938. Robert Pretty would have been about 8 years old at the time. The roller skates were returned to Robert, and they remained on his desk until his death in 1988. The team further defined Mound 2's burial chamber as having been plank-lined with a beam lying across the top of the chamber. Chemical analysis of the soil in the chamber determined that a body had originally lain in the southwest section of the chamber. Once the chamber was built, the body placed inside, along with substantial grave goods, a ship of approximately 20 meters in length was placed on top of the hole. Over time, the ship will have collapsed into the hole, bringing with it ship's rivets and wood. It is thought that the burial might have remained that way, open and without a mound covering the burial, for a considerable period, months, perhaps years, until a special anniversary occurred. This was a high-status Anglo-Saxon burial, and as such, the site of the burial may have been visited by dignitaries, family members, etc., in order to honor the individual buried there. Ultimately, Mound 2 was constructed over the burial. It is estimated that the building of the mound will have taken approximately 660 man-hours. Today, Mound 2 is the tallest mound on the Royal Burial Ground site, visible from across the river near Woodbridge. It is the tallest because when Professor Carver and his team finished their project in 1992, they re-erected the mound to its original height. This could be determined because of the size of the ring ditch at the base of the mound.
Thank you, Kevin. It is truly remarkable to think about what this unassuming mound of soil would once have contained. That's the end of our discussion on Mound 2, and we will now move on towards Mound 1. If you have any questions, look out for one of our roaming guides. There will often be one at the burial ground. Now I can offer you a choice of 2 routes to Mound 1. The longer one will take you left around the burial mounds and onto the viewing tower. Keep listening and I will tell you some features to look out for. It will perhaps take you 10 minutes to walk around to the far end, where you will find a wooden gate to your left for exiting the burial ground. Alternatively, for a shorter route, retrace your steps through the gate to the sandy track and turn left. Follow the track for about 100 yards and go through the gate on the left towards the viewing tower. Whichever route you take, do take in the atmosphere of this place and imagine all the lives that have been touched by it through history. The next of our stories about Mound 1 starts at the base of the viewing tower. If you are taking the longer route, having turned left, you will walk around the Royal Burial Ground. En route, you will pass some of the burial mounds to your right. You will also pass the remains of 2 Second World War anti-glider ditches. These are straight-line grooves running into the burial ground, now about 1 metre wide and half a metre deep. The Royal Burial Ground plus the adjacent farmland was a patchwork of anti-glider ditches during the Second World War. As being a very open landscape, it was an ideal target for landing. Also, the Royal Burial Ground itself was used as a military training ground for infantry and tanks. As you go round, you'll pass a large fir tree on your right, on the right-hand bend in the path. Then you will make your way to the gate on the left. Once through the gate, you should turn right and head along the path leading to the viewing tower.
The viewing tower and Mound 1, the great ship burial.
Now, if you have arrived at the base of the viewing tower, let me help you get your bearings. The tower stands on the edge of the hilltop. Behind us and to its sides are the trees of top hat wood. If you stand at the base of the tower with your back to it, in front of you is the Royal Burial Ground and perimeter wire fence, and within feet across the fence is the western end of Mound 1, the Great Ship Burial Mound. This is your nearest point to the mound, and some people will find this a good vantage point. Alternatively, you may wish to ascend the tower, from which there are views of the whole burial ground and the landscape around it. The tower, which was constructed between November 2018 and June 2020, is 17 metres high. There are 81 steps to the top, and each flight of steps has 9 stairs. The exterior of the tower is covered by thin vertical beams of charred larch cladding, with a gap between each beam to give an open see-through feeling. Already this cladding is beginning to tone down to a silvery grey and will merge with the surrounding woodland, particularly the Scots pines that frame it on its approach. The entrance to the tower is via a 20-metre gently sloping ramp leading to the base of the tower. It has a metal mesh floor with handrails on both sides. The interior of the tower is all metal. There are 2 viewing platforms at the front facing the Royal Burial Ground, one at the lowest level at the end of the ramp, and which is wheelchair accessible. The other is at the top. There are 2 similar platforms at the back, facing towards the river and overlooking Top Hat Wood. Except where the tower is very busy with people, there should be ample room for visitors to pause and take the ascent little by little. Once you are inside the base of the tower, you are just a couple of feet above ground level on the lower viewing platform facing the mounds, and specifically Mound 1. At both this level and at the top, there are mounted plaques that outline the positions of the mounds. At 17 metres high, the views can be spectacular, with the Royal Burial Ground in front and the River Deben behind. Top Hat Wood was planted in the 19th century and now obscures much of the view towards the river. Before that, there would have been a clear line of sight from the Royal Burial Ground down towards the river, and of course vice versa. Now let's get back to Mound 1 and the Great Ship Burial. Kevin, this mound is the main reason why Sutton Hoo is so well known and so important to our knowledge of the Anglo-Saxons. So please could you tell us some more about it and what it contained?
Whichever position you've chosen as your viewpoint, by the fence, at the lower platform of the tower, or the top one, you'll be standing at the west end of the mound, where the stern of the buried ship was. The mound that is visible now is oval in shape, a little over 30 meters long, 20 meters wide, and 2 meters high. The top is generally flat, but with a shallow boat-shaped recess in the center running away from you. This is representative of the shape of the mound before it was excavated. There's a triangular metal structure on the mound near your position. That signifies the original position of the stern or back of the ship. There's a corresponding structure at the east end of the mound, furthest from you, which signifies the position of the bow or front of the ship. The ship discovered under Mound 1 was 27 meters long, 4.5 meters wide, and 1.5 meters deep in its center. It is believed to have been approximately 20 years old when it went into the ground and had been well used and repaired, as evidenced by random scatterings of additional rivets found in certain areas of the skeleton of the ship during Basil Brown's discovery in 1939. Built within the ship was a burial chamber made of wooden walls and a pitched roof. You should be aware that the height of the mound differs between the east and west ends, being substantially lower at the west end nearest you. Mound 1 is one of the 2 known mounds on this site that remained intact. During Basil Brown's excavation of the mound, he discovered evidence of an attempt to rob the mound. A change in the color of the soil, a scorched area, and remnants of a bottle showed him that the robbers had indeed tried to find treasure here. The robbers would typically choose the center of a mound and dig directly down. As Mound 1 is lower at the west end, this suggests the shape of the mound changed from the time that the ship was buried to the time of the robbery attempt early in the 17th century. Therefore, the robbers chose the wrong center of the mound and subsequently missed the treasure.
It's incredible to think how lucky we are that they missed it. Just imagine if those robbers had dug a few feet further over. We may never have known what this mound once contained, and all those exquisite objects that have taught us so much about the early Anglo-Saxon period. So how did they go about excavating such a huge mound in 1939?
Well, after the first season of excavation in 1938, Basil Brown returned to Sutton Hoo on Edith Pretty's invitation on the 8th of May, 1939. Edith appointed two of her staff to assist with the excavation, John Jacobs, who was the groundskeeper, and William Spooner, who was the gameskeeper. As in 1938, Basil asked Mrs. Pretty where she would like him to begin, and she requested he start with Mound 1, which was the largest mound. So on the 8th of May, Basil and his two helpers began digging a 6-foot-wide trench into the east end of the mound. 3 days later, on the 11th of May, John Jacobs picked up an object and, holding it up, said, "I found a lump of iron." Soon after, they found 5 more such objects. Basil immediately recognized these as being ship's rivets. He then changed the orientation of their dig so that they would be digging up and over and then down into the vessel. With such a large amount of sandy soil to be removed, there were occasions of landslides. Several times over the course of their excavation, progress with the dig had to stop so that the spoil heaps could be removed further away from the excavation. Ultimately, these spoil heaps were formed into tiers with supporting timbers in place to prevent further landslips. Guy Maynard, curator of the Ipswich Museum at the time, having come out here and seen the large ship being revealed, inadvertently let news of the discovery leak out to the archaeological world. Charles Phillips, a British archaeologist and fellow at Selwyn College, Cambridge University, paid a visit to Sutton Hoo with Guy Maynard. He noted that the excavation had been very well performed thus far, but warned Mrs. Pretty that a dig of such importance should be carried out by professionals. He suggested that Basil Brown and his assistants stop digging. Fortunately, with the Second World War approaching, Basil carried on digging for a further 4 weeks. Charles Phillips ultimately was appointed to head the excavation of the burial chamber, whilst Basil Brown focused on the excavation of the ship itself. Over the course of early to mid-July, Charles Phillips brought in a team of professional archaeologists, but Edith Pretty insisted that Basil Brown remain involved in the project. Peggy and Stuart Piggott were two of Charles Phillips' team. In the latter part of July, whilst excavating the burial chamber, it was Peggy Piggott who first discovered a gold and garnet pyramid-shaped object. Then she found a second one. These were the fittings from the scabbard of a sword. Over the course of the next several days, the team uncovered 263 individual items of gold, garnet, silver, bronze, ceramic, iron, and stone.
Now, we do not intend to list all of the 263 items found here, but what we can do is to mention some of them and group them into a number of functional areas that this warrior king, according to the beliefs of the time, would have needed for his afterlife in Valhalla. Later, in the High Hall exhibition, we have a number of replica items to help build this picture for you as well.
Yes, the individual items can be categorized under 4 headings, which each relate to the man buried in the ship. Firstly, we have the man as the host of a great feast. Discovered within the burial chamber were many items associated with and required for a great feast. There were drinking horns, cauldrons, and pots, a great hanging cauldron whose chain was 3.7 meters in length, indicative of the height of the roofing timbers of a great hall. There were silver dishes, bowls, silver spoons. There was the great silver Anastasius dish made from a single lump of silver, first thought to be a shield when discovered. Also, for entertainment were found the part remains of a lyre, a pegged and strung instrument, and gaming pieces. Next, we have the man as a warrior. Also found within the chamber were items of weaponry, including the great Sutton Hoo helmet, shattered into more than 500 pieces, the remains from an iron mail coat, the magnificent pattern-welded sword, a collection of spears and angons, which are similar to javelins, an axe hammer, and a massive shield. Then the man as a king. He was dressed in glittering parade outfit with a sword scabbard and belt adorned with fine gold and garnet mountings. He had a scepter containing a massive carved whetstone and a stag ornament, an iron stand, which was a symbol of his power, and fabulous gold and garnet shoulder clasps. He wore a solid gold belt buckle, and next to that was a gold and ceramic purse lid. Collected below the purse lid were 37 stamped gold coins, 3 blank gold coins, and 2 gold ingots. Each coin was unique, and each came from a different mint in Moravian Gaul, dating from 575 to 625 AD. And then finally, as a man, there are remnants of a collection of fine clothing and shoes, personal items for comfort in the afterlife. Because of the acid soil here, almost all organic material had disappeared. So many of the items were loose in the sandy soil and fragmentary. But gold, silver, the garnets, and the glass and some copper alloy survived in superb condition.
Okay, so having unearthed all these items, what happens next? Who did they belong to? And who was going to look after them?
Now, following these fantastic discoveries, there was a treasure trove inquest in the village of Sutton on the 14th of August 1939 to determine ownership. It all depended on whether the treasure was buried as a hoard to be retrieved later or as a burial offering to remain with the deceased. Many people involved in the excavations gave witness statements. As a result, Edith Pretty, as landowner, was awarded the treasures. Within days, during which the treasures were stored at Tranmer House, then called Sutton Hoo House, Edith Pretty decided to give the treasures to the British Museum so that the nation could see their beauty. For the duration of the Second World War, the treasures were stored in a disused underground station in London and were first displayed to the British public at the Festival of Britain in 1951. Today, many of the original objects from Mound 1 are on display in the British Museum. We're very lucky to have some items return on loan occasionally for temporary exhibitions, and in our permanent High Hall exhibition, which you'll be visiting shortly, we have high-quality replicas of some of the most important items discovered in Mound 1.
So we know what happened to the objects found within the ship, but what about the fossil of the ship itself? What happened to that?
The ship revealed, just in the shapes of the planking and the sand, with the iron rivets protruding, had only been covered with sacking, bracken, and some branches by Basil Brown as war was declared, there being no time to backfill with soil. Basil hoped the war would not go on too long and the ship could be uncovered for people to see, but this is how it remained throughout the war, during which time military training activities had tanks driving over it.
That just seems amazing to us these days and difficult for us to fully comprehend, considering what we know about the discovery now. But of course they were different times with different priorities. Sadly, Edith Pretty died during the war in 1942 before the amazing finds were studied in any detail or displayed to the public. So we need to pick up the story again after the war.
Well, after the war, Rupert Bruce Mitford, who joined the British Museum, was given responsibility for the analysis of the Sutton Hoo ship burial and finds, and this became his major life's work for many years. Although the 1939 excavation had achieved a great deal and a measurement survey had been performed by the Science Museum, all had been done in a very short time prior to the outbreak of the war. Many questions remained, including whether there had been a body in the grave. A subsequent excavation took place between 1965 and 1971, led by Rupert Bruce Mitford. He led a research project at Sutton Hoo to reopen Mound 1, looking for additional artifacts, undertake a new survey of their remains, as some of the original records had been lost during the war, and to prove whether or not a body had once lain in the burial chamber. The 1939 spoil hoops produced 34 additional pieces, including 2 small brooches, 2 buckles, more fragments from the helmet, and minute fragments of tine from the stag, which was part of the scepter, an object you'll hear about in the High Hall exhibition. Also, analysis of the soil at the base of the burial chamber showed increased phosphate levels that strongly indicated that a body had indeed once lain within the ship. Then, to see if there was anything under the ship, to tell of the pre-Anglo-Saxon history, the team had to dig through the ship. The fossil ship was by now in a much degraded state, and it was not thought possible to preserve it. So the fossil is no longer there. But before they dug through it, they took a full-scale fiberglass cast, although it is now twisted and distorted from his exposure and wartime experience. During these excavations in 1966, Rupert Bruce Mitford wrote to Basil Brown, asking if he would wish to come and see his ship once more, which he did do along with his wife, May. Rupert Bruce Mitford was also tasked with the production of the definitive Sutton Hoo publication and achieved this in his magnum opus, the Sutton Hoo Ship Burial, comprising 2,441 pages of text and hundreds of illustrations, which was published in 3 volumes between 1975 and 1983.
You know, when you look at this mound, it still does not seem real to think of the incredible funeral that was held here over 1400 years ago, and what a spectacle it must have been. And then, of course, the more recent scene of archaeologists scrambling to excavate one of the richest graves ever discovered as the Second World War loomed. Well, that's the end of our story about Mound 1, but certainly not the end of the ship's story, because there is a replica being built.
The Sutton Hoo Ships Company building the replica of the Sutton Hoo ship.
There is a current experimental archaeological project to build, launch, row and sail a full-size replica of the Sutton Hoo Great Ship. The Sutton Hoo Ships Company is a charitable trust which is currently building the ship in the Long Shed just across the river from us on the Woodbridge waterfront. It is separate from the National Trust Sutton Hoo, but we share a common interest in the project and its outcomes. Although there have been a number of replica Viking longships built, these are from 200 to 300 years later and differ from Anglo-Saxon ships in a number of ways. This new ship will be the first full-size reconstruction of an Anglo-Saxon ship undertaken anywhere. It is also being built using only the tools and techniques available in the 7th century and will help us to learn how the Sutton Hoo ship was built and what it might have been used for before its final role as the resting place for a great king. This is a multi-year project that will gain a lot of publicity as it evolves, but progress can be viewed at the Long Shed on most days of the week. There is a website also, saxonship.org, but do an internet search on Sutton Hoo Ships Company and you will find it. There is a lot of information there. But now let's move on because we have another story to tell you, and that is about the warrior horseman buried in Mound 17. From the base of the viewing tower and facing Mound 1 where we started, take the track that runs left alongside the wire fence. This is back towards Tranmer House and the Sutton Hoo main buildings. As you move away from Mound 1, you'll pass a flat, grassed area of the Royal Burial Ground on your right, and in around 60 metres you will come to 2 flint-marked graves near a large ash tree. This is Mound 17, the Horseman's Mound.
Mound 17, the Horseman's Mound.
Here's an example where the soil that made up the mound originally has been removed for the purpose of farming or to make soil-based boundary walls or for some other purpose. Mound 17 was discovered by accident in 1991. This discovery was made during the research project that Professor Martin Carver led here between 1986 and 1992. During the project, the archaeologist often stayed overnight on site. Professor Carver liked to practice his golf chipping during the evenings, especially from the top of Mound 1 and in the direction of Mound 12, which is just a few feet further on from Mound 17. Each time the ball fell short, it rolled in such a way that they believed there had to have been something there to be found. There was Mound 17. This mound is the only other mound to have remained intact as far as we know. However, the archaeologists did discern 2 failed attempts to rob the mound. Excavation can be an uncomfortable experience, and during this one, the archaeologists had to be suspended by a sling over the rightmost grave for 3 weeks, removing the soil as carefully as possible in order to be able to show the vision seen by the mourners in approximately 600 AD. The grave contained the part skeletal remains of a young warrior. He had been buried in a hollowed-out oak log or coffin. Next to the coffin was a bucket and a cauldron. Under a bronze bowl was a small collection of bones, which after analysis proved to be the remnants of lamb chops that would have been held in a leather bag at one time. Next to the skeleton was a long sword. Evidence of another pouch was found that contained a piece of millefleurs glass and a garnet. Just prior to revealing the skeletal remains of the warrior in the soil above the coffin, the archaeologists found the remains of a bone comb. This was in an upright position, and because of its position in the soil, it's believed that the comb was dropped into the grave by a close mourner as an afterthought and prior to the grave being covered. Also in the grave were the remains of the horse's harness with the highly decorated gilded bronze mounts. In the leftmost grave was the part skeletal remains of the warrior's horse. This was part skeleton and part sand body.
Another incredible discovery, and another reminder of how lucky we are that those 17th century grave robbers were not always successful. What happened to the objects that were discovered in this mound?
The artifacts found in the graves of Mound 17 are on display in the High Hall exhibition here at Sutton Hoo. They are on permanent loan from the British Museum.
The sand bodies.
Kevin, what did you mean earlier when you said part sand body?
Well, let me explain. It seems in this field that when something organic decays, it leaves a crusty, sandy shape of the object as it was. An example being the great ship discovered under Mound 1. When looking at photos of the great ship, one would think they were seeing wooden planking, when in fact it was crusty sand. It is the same with part of the remains of the warrior's horse discovered under Mound 17. It was not a complete skeleton. It was part skeleton, part crusty sand or sand body. We have many other examples of this within the Royal Burial Ground. During Professor Martin Carver's excavations between 1986 and 1992, his team discovered 39 shallow graves dating to between the 8th and 11th centuries, so after this field was used as the Royal Burial Ground. These are referred to as deviant burials due to the manner of the burials. 16 of these graves appear to have been close to Mound 5, while 23 graves were in the farm field outside of the current eastern boundary of the Royal Burial Ground. Mound 5 is approximately 15 meters directly east of Mound 17. These graves contained sand bodies. Professor Carver referred to them when first discovered as stains in the sand that could only be located by the change in the color of the sandy soil. Once located, by spraying a fine liquid on the objects, their shape could be further identified. These people were buried without any honor in rather shallow graves. Some were bound, some were beheaded, some were buried in odd positions, all were sand bodies. It is believed that these people were put to death, likely for crimes. It is suggested that there were gallows near Mound 5, and that is why 16 of the graves surrounded that area. It is believed that the gallows were moved further east at some point, and that is why 23 graves were discovered outside of the current Royal Burial Ground boundary. This all adds to the incredible history that took place here at Sutton Hoo.
That is incredible. Thanks very much, Kevin, for telling us about this amazing place.
Oh, you're very welcome, and thanks for visiting.
Now we need to make our way back to the courtyard and main buildings here at Sutton Hoo to get to the High Hall exhibition. From Mound 17 and the Royal Burial Ground, continue to follow the track left through the gate back onto the sandy track. Go straight forward here for 100 metres until you find on the left the gate back towards the main buildings. Just follow this path under the trees, through a metal gate, and onto the courtyard and ship sculpture. Our next section will be called High Hall Exhibition, and it is in several parts.
Section 6, the High Hall Exhibition Introduction.
This and the next 4 sections are about the High Hall Exhibition, which will tell you about Anglo-Saxon life and the death of a great king. The amazing range and quality of the grave goods found in the great ship burial have enabled archaeologists and historians to lift the veil on the Dark Ages and tell us a lot about the ancestors of this land. You will have come back to the courtyard, the ship sculpture, and the other main buildings. At the top of the site is the High Hall, a large rectangular single-storey grey timber-clad building with an overhanging pitched roof. The main car park is on the right, and there is an area of grass on the left. The hall itself was built on the site of a late 6th century Anglo-Saxon folk cemetery, which was discovered and excavated in 1999 to 2000 before the High Hall construction began. One cremation burial of a high-status woman discovered here is featured in the exhibition. Now come with me towards the entrance, and I see we are about to be met by a man splendidly dressed in Anglo-Saxon attire.
Gudni dag, we sath ye harl at theum her cellar, or in modern English, good day, welcome to the High Hall. A powerful king, Radwald of East Anglia, has died after a 20-year rule. He lies in a magnificent ship burial that celebrates his reign. This was an age of political and religious upheaval. Rival Anglo-Saxon leaders fought for dominance, and a new religion was spreading from the south. Life was on the brink of change. The High Hall transports you to the vibrant Anglo-Saxon world of Sutton Hoo, and we invite you to step inside to meet the people that surrounded the king and his court. Many of these characters are based on people excavated in the Sutton Hoo cemeteries. For others, we have taken inspiration from the wider world of the 6th and 7th century England.
This is Ernie, another of our Sutton Hoo guides, who has just welcomed us in Old English, and then spoken the words engraved on a large copper plate hanging to the right of the entrance, welcoming visitors to the exhibition. Ernie, we understood the modern English welcome, and thank you for that. But your first words to us were not in a language familiar to us at all. Can you repeat them and tell us more about that language?
Yes, Gudni dag, good day. We sath ye harl at theum her cellar, welcome to the High Hall. The language is of a Germanic origin, and today the modern languages that we know as Norwegian, Swedish, Dutch and German come from the same root.
Thank you very much, Ernie. Now as we go towards the entrance, we meet Sally, our next guide, who will take us into the High Hall. Hello, Sally. We have been welcomed in Old English by Ernie. We have accepted that welcome, and we are ready to come with you into the main exhibition.
Right then, let's enter the High Hall through the 2 sets of double glass doors in front of us. These are usually already open, except during very cold or windy weather, but do take care, they are glass, and the inside of the hall is a lot darker than outside. This is also where we will exit at the end of our visit. The walls on either side of this entrance are covered in rough-hewn oak, the same wood that the great ship was built from. You're welcome to touch the wood as you pass through. The ground here is level, as is most of the exhibition space, but just be aware that there is some coconut matting as you enter the building.
Now as we go inside, you'll notice that it is quite dimly lit. So while we get used to this reduced light level, perhaps Sally, would you describe the inside of the High Hall and its layout for us?
Yes, of course. Let me help you get your bearings. The hall is a large single-storey level space. At its centre, right in front of you, is a 6-metre diameter cylindrical region with, at the farthest end, a 4-metre-high sculpture depicting the facial elements of the famous Sutton Hoo helmet. To our right is a large information board and timeline of key events in our history. There are various exhibits both inside and around the central cylinder, which we will visit. There are also benches built into the walls for you to sit on while listening to the audio guide, as there's quite a lot to tell. So please do make use of these. Of course, you can skip forward and backwards using the navigation buttons to find the stories that particularly interest you, and pause at any time to examine the displays and listen to the audio dramatisations that you'll be able to hear in various places.
Yes, there is a lot to experience within this exhibition, but all of the exhibits focused on objects actually unearthed here at Sutton Hoo, either from the burial sites or discovered elsewhere on the site. Perhaps we can take these areas one at a time as we move around the hall.
Absolutely. And the first thing we come to on the right-hand side when entering was a large information board. At the top, there is a timeline of key events of the Anglo-Saxon period, from the departure of the Romans in AD 410 up to the Norman invasion in 1066. This includes the arrival of Christianity in the 6th century to challenge the older pagan traditions. When the Romans withdrew from their governance and control of Britain, different northern European tribes, the Angles, Saxons, Jutes and Frisians, began to cross the North Sea, landing along the east and south coasts and moving up the rivers into the centre of the country. Initially, they came as winter migrants, working and trading with communities already living here. As time passed, they made this country their home, mingling and intermarrying to eventually become the Anglo-Saxons. Various power groups became dominant in certain areas of what is now England, and these became kingdoms, East Anglia, where we are now, being one of them. This information board illustrates this. The text is quite large, and there is a map showing the major regions of Britain at this time. However, this is an excellent point to pause the player if you wish, and ask the volunteer guide on duty to explain it to you in more detail. He or she will be able to tell you a lot more than we can include here. Otherwise, just keep listening and we will move on. Now, let's get some context for our exhibits here by visiting the cinema, where there is a short film in which two women are preparing some of the king's possessions for burial in the great ship following his death. The film lasts approximately 10 minutes and is on a continuous loop. The information here is mostly in the dialogue, although the images do convey an atmosphere of the occasion. Come into the cinema, which is to the left of the entrance, and take a seat. There's no handrail to guide you, and there are steps down to the seating, so please take care. Our guides will be happy to help you. Here, you will hear them discussing the different ideas people had at this time about the afterlife. There is a growing contrast between the ideas of grave goods reflecting someone's status, compared with the simplicity of someone's soul laid unadorned before God. Remember, this was the time of change, as the pagan beliefs were making way for the new religion, Christianity.
Thank you, Sally. Once the film ends, retrace your steps to the entrance. After the cinema, where should we go next, Sally?
On the left, as you come out of the cinema, is the dressing up corner. It has some tunics, jackets and caps for children of all ages to try out. There are 2 plastic copies of the Sutton Hoo helmet to try on as well. Or you may just like to look at these helmets at close quarters, as our metal display replica, which we'll get to later, is behind glass. Quite often the grown-ups enjoy this area as much as the children, and it's a good photo opportunity too.
So a bit of light relief and fun for the kids of all ages, even all you adults. That's brilliant. Now, after dressing up and taking photos, we will move to the next section, called The King's Burial.
Section 7, the High Hall exhibition, The Burial Chamber.
This part of the exhibition focuses on the king's burial and the symbols of status and power that were buried with him. But we will also put this into context by describing the beliefs of the Anglo-Saxons in the early 7th century that influenced their burial practices, particularly for a king. Please go forward from the entrance into the central cylindrical area and find one of the bench seats set into the inner wall, either on the right or on the left. This will be a good place to sit while you listen to this part of the story. So, Sally, please tell us about what is in this area.
Well, at the centre of this space, set into the tiled floor, is a plan of the burial chamber discovered in 1939. Many of the items which survived have been marked on the plan. The body was placed in a coffin and laid towards the western end of the chamber, which is on your left. The weapons, jewels, clothing, ceremonial wear, as well as buckets, dishes, knives, goblets, and all manner of items a king might need for his journey to the next life, were laid or hung around the walls and floor space of the chamber. This would have been a most luxurious, comfortable, and well-stocked chamber, ready for the journey to Valhalla. Behind is the large sculpture evoking the face of the king's helmet and highlighting some of its powerful elements. The bird that forms the nosepiece, moustache and eyebrows, with the boar's heads at the wingtips, totemic symbols of the gods. Above each eye is a line of garnets, but only the right one shines out. On the real helmet, it was found that the right-hand side had reflecting foil behind each garnet, but the left side didn't. This is believed to be a reference to the god Woden, who sacrificed the sight in his left eye for knowledge. All these symbols would have reinforced the king's power in the eyes of the people. The wall cabinets inside the cylinder show some of the spectacular examples of the weapons, jewellery and symbols of power from the ship burial. These are all replicas, and the skill of the modern craftsman is impressive, but matched equally by that of the original craftsman 1400 years ago. This shows you how stunning the whole collection of items must have looked as it was buried under the ground in the early 7th century. The original objects from the burial are all in the British Museum, having been donated to the nation by Edith Pretty. Occasionally, objects return to Sutton Hoo on loan for temporary exhibitions. I'll describe the objects in more detail in a minute, but first let's consider the significance of the ship burial and its contents of grave goods. As you've already heard, the ship excavation revealed the impression of a huge oak ship, 27 metres or 90 feet long. Up to 40 oarsmen were required to move it through the water. This was an impressive vessel, owned by a wealthy, powerful person. A ship burial was the greatest honour that could be given, and only for the most powerful people, usually kings. All the items found in 1939 indicated this burial was of the highest order. The opulence and skill shown in everything found was exceptional. It is, in fact, the largest ship burial from Anglo-Saxon time that has been found anywhere. You heard the two women in the film discussing preparations for the burial of a king. They talked about items he would need for his journey to Valhalla. This was the place Anglo-Saxons believed noble warriors went to after death. It was imagined as a huge hall. The greatest warriors feasted all night, then battled all day, forever. The greater the warrior or king, the greater the generosity and hospitality expected. Vast cooking cauldrons and buckets for water, mead, and celebration would be needed. Huge drinking horns were made to share at the feast. Leisure items of games and musical instruments, clothing, furs and textiles were needed, as well as fabulous jewellery, weapons and symbols of power or status. All this needed to be placed in a vessel for the journey to the other side. The vast number of exotic and valuable grave goods found, not to mention items that have long since rotted into the soil, demonstrated that the warrior buried at Sutton Hoo had been extremely powerful, wealthy and revered.
Yes, I can certainly see it would be a great way of honouring a great king to bury him within his ship with his assemblage of grave goods. But is there a deeper significance about why so many exotic and valuable items were put in the ship in the first place? The ship burial implies that Christianity had not yet reached this part of Britain. Did it have any influence on religious practices here? And did all Anglo-Saxons believe the same at this time?
Well, the early 7th century was a period of transition in religious beliefs. Anglo-Saxon settlers brought with them their beliefs based on the pagan gods of multiple gods, such as Thor, Freya and Woden or Odin. The landscape was also considered to have spiritual properties. Timber provided shelter, protection, animal feed and medicinal properties. The ash tree, for example, was used as the shaft of spears because it grows straight. It was also believed to have powers of protection, so stockades or fences were constructed with it. Animals and birds had their place, and many had associations with gods. The birds, such as eagles and ravens, with Woden, and stags with Freya. Nature had to be respected. People needed to work in harmony with it if they were to survive and thrive. The Romans had many gods themselves, so the Norse gods might be seen as a continuation of this system. The early 7th century was a time of change, however. Christianity had gradually moved across Europe, and by the late 6th century, missionaries had arrived on the south coast. The Venerable Bede wrote about the development of Christianity in Britain. Although written years after this great ship burial, it's reasonable to think there were many people who remembered this tradition. Bede records King Radwald, the king of East Anglia, being baptised in Canterbury around 605 AD or CE. He also writes about Radwald's queen and her reaction to this when he returned. She retained the old beliefs. Radwald set up a Christian altar alongside the pagan one in his temple. Was this for marital harmony? Keeping his subjects loyal? Hedging his bets, or what? We don't know. The rhetoric in Bede's account indicates that he was extremely displeased, writing from his Christian perspective. People would likely have heard about the new Christian God by now, and may have been questioning which religion they should follow. So, this was a time of real change. Here was a pagan burial, but it also contained items with Christian symbolism. There were 2 silver spoons marked Saulus and Paulus in Greek, probably from the Eastern Mediterranean. Such spoons are often presented to someone when they have been baptised into the Christian church. Were these perhaps baptismal gifts to King Radwald? There was a set of 10 silver dishes with Celtic-style crosses inscribed in them. But then clearly the style of burial and the inclusion of weapons, feasting, entertainment and personal items was inherently pagan. So there's a lot of things we just can't fully explain.
It is very interesting, and it brings us to the point when we need to talk about the actual burial and items found in the grave. What do we have in this central part of the exhibition? Was a body found in the burial chamber of the ship?
No, there were no human remains found, but subsequent analysis of an area of discoloured soil found traces of phosphates, which are characteristic elements associated with decomposition of a body. So we believe there was indeed a body buried here.
But why were there no bones or even tooth enamel?
Well, the soil at Sutton Hoo is very acidic. If you think about the ship, buried below ground level for over 1,000 years, with water seeping in and settling at the bottom of it, then any organic matter would soon be dissolved, rather like an acid bath.
So surely it must have been impossible to identify who was buried in the great ship.
You might think so, and we'll never be sure. But King Radwald is the most likely candidate from the dating evidence we have associated with the Merovingian coins found with the purse and correlated with Bede's account. Do ask the guides about this evidence if you're interested, and why this points to Radwald.
Thank you very much, Sally. Now we are going to look at some of the replica items on display here, starting on the left and moving around clockwise. After each description, there will be an opportunity to pause the player and then to resume before moving on to the next. You can use the skip backward button to repeat an item or skip forward to move on. Now the first object we come to, mounted on the wall on the left by the seat, is an iron standard. Sally, can you please tell us something about this item?
Yes, this is a 2-metre long iron pole. It has a basket-like structure at its top, with sharp horn-like attachments at each corner as well as at its centre. The basket-like area is quite open, with no evidence of retaining walls to hold logs, so possibly not suitable as a brazier. It has fine twisted strips creating the edges of the basket. It is not only a functional piece though. Looking carefully at it, you can see the twists counter-rotate, making this decorative as well as functional. Such intricate decoration can be found on other pieces of ironwork we will see later in this tour. As with so many of the objects found in the great ship, their purpose or functions elude us. You may wish to speculate for yourself as to its purpose. It may not even have been a standard. The spike at the opposite end of the basket structure has decorative barbs, so it may not have been able to be driven into the ground deeply enough to support its weight. You will have to decide for yourself as to its purpose.
Thank you. Now let's move on clockwise to the next object, which is the shield in a glass cabinet.
This cabinet contains a large circular shield, 1 metre in diameter. It's made from lime wood, covered with red leather. Around its circumference are alternating decorations of gilt bronze dragon heads and rectangular gilded embossed bronze plates. There are 12 of each, extending 6 to 8 centimetres in from the rim. At the centre is a large decorated iron boss with cast bronze animal decorations. This was hollow at the back, large enough for a man's hand to grip a handle to support the shield. On either side of the boss are 2 ornate gilt bronze creatures. One is a bird of prey, the other a dragon. Animal motifs offered power and protection and were a common feature in many of the Anglo-Saxon objects found. Here, the bird of prey refers to Woden, the god of war, and the dragon to war and power. The guides will be happy to provide further detail about the shield. Because of its weight and size, this was most likely a ceremonial shield, possibly an heirloom or a gift from another king, and would have demonstrated the power of its owner as well as the protective power endowed by the gods through the animal images. The limewood base and leather coverings, being organic, had rotted away, but the iron boss and gilded bronze fittings were all found. These fittings you can see here are exact replicas of the originals.
This is a very impressive piece. Do you know who made it, or where it was made indeed?
That's a good question. Studying the original shield carefully, experts think it was made in Sweden. If this is the case, it is further evidence to support the case for King Radwald being the person buried in the great ship. His family, the Woffing dynasty, originated around the area of Jutland and southern Sweden, and a similar shield with some identical elements has been discovered in a Swedish burial site.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next display case, to the right-hand side of the big sculpture. This houses the truly impressive and iconic helmet.
Yes. We have both the helmet and the shoulder clasps here in the cabinet. This cabinet is different from the others in the area because it has glass on both front and back. That means you can see the back of the helmet later as we move around the outside of the exhibition. This spectacular replica helmet looks silver in colour with some gilt areas on the front. The silver's actually tinned copper alloy in the form of rectangular embossed plaques, about 3 by 5 centimetres in size, mounted onto the iron helmet bowl and attached with tinned copper alloy strips and rivets. Only parts of the original survived, but there were sufficient fragments for the British Museum experts to create this replica design. The plaques are of different designs. 2 are figurative images. One is known as the Fallen Warrior, and the other is of dancing warriors. There was originally a 3rd figurative plaque, but too little of it remained to recover its design. The other plaques are of 2 different zoomorphic designs of intertwined snakes and animals. The face guard looks like a bird of prey with outstretched wings and was the model for our sculpture you have just passed. It is of gilded copper alloy, the body as the nose piece, the outstretched wings as eyebrows, and the tail as a moustache. At each tip of the bird's wings is a gilded boar's head in profile. Boars represented power, kinship, and protection in battle. Strips of deep red garnets are set into the lower edges of the eyebrows or wings. As the bird seems to soar upwards, its head touches that of a serpent, which is coming over the crest of the helmet. This is a double-headed serpent running all the way over the top of the helmet, down to the nape of the neck at the back, and was actually a protection against sword strikes from above. The original helmet shows signs of such a strike. The beasts on it have garnet stones for eyes. If you'd like to, ask one of the guides for a more detailed description of the helmet's appearance and the decorative panels affixed to it. These can be tricky to make out, but they may be more easily seen or felt on one of the plastic helmets found in the dressing up corner. Please do make use of these.
It really is impressive. The plaque showing a battle scene is a bit of a puzzle though. It shows a horseman charging forward, holding a spear, trampling a foe underfoot, but the foe is thrusting a sword into the horse's breast. So who's winning here? You may want to make up your own mind on that one. However, it could be a reference to a battlefield tactic recorded by the Romans, whereby a foot soldier disables the horse in order to dismount its rider for easier dispatch. Unfortunately, we can't answer all the questions, not yet, and maybe not ever. Now here are another couple of questions. How heavy was it? And was it ceremonial or meant to be worn in battle?
Well, this replica weighs 3.5 kilos, or about 7 pounds. But the British Museum's estimate for the original is about 2.5 kilos. That's still quite heavy, and it's also possible that it restricted the wearer's vision and breathing to some extent. However, do remember that the Romans wore iron helmets, which would have been of a similar weight. As to the other question, the Anglo-Saxons seem to have wanted to dress to impress, as if to say, look who you're dealing with. On the existing pieces of the original helmet, there is some evidence of sword damage or blows to the back of it. This king did not die in battle, so maybe this amazing helmet did protect him. It's very hard to be sure, but a king wearing this helmet and coming at you wielding a sword would have been a pretty scary sight.
It certainly would. Do we also know if this came from Sweden along with a shield? Is there any evidence for that at all?
Well, we have to say it's not clear. There are similarities with some helmets unearthed in Sweden, particularly in the design of the plaques, which might suggest a common origin. But the British Museum experts tell us that this helmet was made using a single bowl of iron as its foundation, a technique common in these islands from Roman times, whereas the Scandinavian helmets were made from strips of iron joined together. So this would support a theory that it was made here. We don't know, but we must consider the possibility that craftsmen migrated here with their tools and patterns and merged their skills with the local ones to create this helmet.
Thank you. Well, that's the front of the helmet, and the back is visible from the other side when we get there. But on either side of the helmet is a pair of solid gold and garnet shoulder clasps, which are quite exquisite. Although similar clasps have been known from Roman times, this pair of Anglo-Saxon ones is unique in decoration and the quite exceptional quality of its craftsmanship.
Yes, indeed. Each of these are about 5 centimetres wide, and they're in 2 parts, fastened together by a hinge and a removable gold pin. Each half is curved in section and consists of a rectangular plate with rounded end, about 6 centimetres long. The hinge runs along the straight end. The clasp has loops for attaching it to a garment underneath. The rectangular plate contains a central panel of 15 cloisonné cells filled alternately with deep red garnets and blue and white millefiori glass. These are interspersed with slightly larger plain garnet cells. The central panel is bordered on each side with designs of interlacing serpents or snakes, their bodies formed of inlaid garnets and their eyes of blue glass. The rounded end contains 2 interlinked boars executed in garnet cloisonné. Their heads are down and their curved backs form the rounded end of the clasps. Their hip joints are inlaid with millefiori glass. The spaces between their legs are filled with a gold filigree design of snake-like creatures. The cells behind the boar's back legs are lidded with gold foil. The garnet cells are all lined with crinkled gold foil to make them reflect the light. After 1,300 years in the ground, the original shoulder clasp emerged still in virtually perfect condition, very close visually to our replicas here, just exuding greater quality, we think. These clasps would have been used to secure a fairly heavy piece of fabric or leather, which did not survive the acid conditions.
It's easy to see what a high level of skill the makers of these clasps must have had. Do you know where they were made?
Stylistic evidence seems to indicate they were made here, near Sutton Hoo, possibly at Rendlesham, the site of a large Anglo-Saxon royal settlement where there is evidence of extensive metalworking. One of the guides will be happy to tell you more about Rendlesham and the links with other fine jewellery that form part of the Staffordshire hoard.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next cabinet to the right, which contains a very impressive sword. Of course, this is a modern replica, but we do know from the scientific analysis of the fragmentary remains found that this is a realistic representation. And we also have a scabbard and more cloisonné objects.
Yes, that's right. The belt and scabbard are made from red leather. The leather belt is embossed and further decorated with cloisonné gold and garnet mounts. It is secured with a triangular-shaped cloisonné gold and garnet buckle. The sword's scabbard is also covered in embossed red leather. 2 thin leather straps hang on either side, onto which are attached small, flat-topped gold and garnet pyramids. The cloisonné gold and garnet mounts are of truly exceptional quality, like the shoulder clasps. The sword blade has been etched to show a sinuous pattern along its centre. This is not only decorative, but reveals the presence of pattern welding in its core, giving it strength. Its hilt is decorated with gold, garnets and ivory. The craftsman section coming later will look at the making of swords and the cloisonné jewellery in more detail.
Thank you, Sally. Now let's move on again to the right to the last of the glass-fronted display cases. What can we see here, please?
Well, firstly, you remember those 2 silver spoons I mentioned earlier, possibly baptismal spoons made in the Eastern Mediterranean? These are displayed in this case, and the stems are each marked with the names Saulus and Paulus in Greek. So, were they perhaps given to King Radwald during his baptismal ceremony by the Kentish king down in Canterbury in 605? We actually have no idea, but it is a possibility. On the left, there is another enigmatic object. It is referred to by several terms: a standard, a sceptre, or a whetstone. It comprises a 4-sided bar of hard, fine-grained grey stone, 58 centimetres long and 5 centimetres square. The bar tapers at each end to where long, rather triangular faces have been carved on each of the sides, both top and bottom, all different, some with beards, some without. So who do these represent? Are they gods or perhaps the ancestors? We don't know. Each end of the bar ultimately terminates in a carved, lobed knob, roughly onion-shaped and originally painted red. Each knob is enclosed by a cage of copper alloy ridged strips. At the bottom is a cup-shaped copper alloy piece, possibly for it to stand on. Then the top is surmounted by a 10-centimetre diameter iron ring, upon which is mounted a cast copper alloy stag about 10 centimetres high.
You say it's enigmatic, and it has been referred to as a sceptre or a whetstone. But do we have any idea what this was used for?
As with other objects, such as the iron standard, we're just not sure of the purpose or function of this item. It is unique in its composition, but in shape does resemble Roman sceptres owned by holders of high office. We could speculate that it may have been like some sort of sceptre, but it's quite heavy if it was meant to be held for any length of time. Due to the stone used, it may have been a whetstone for sharpening blades, but it's really too big for this, and there is no sign of wear. Then, if we consider the stag at the top, in the early Germanic world, this was a symbol of strength and speed and may have been symbolic of the protection it offered. So we probably have to see this as a symbolic object for a powerful ruler and the ultimate whetstone to keep all blades sharp and ready for battle. It's a mystery, and you may speculate yourself on its significance.
Thank you so much, Sally. So, this whole area has explained the burial chamber, where many of the 263 items were discovered, as well as shown us wonderful replica pieces that demonstrate the wealth, power and status of the person who was buried within it.
Indeed, and we only feature a selection of the items discovered in 1939. Such an extraordinary range of objects, in many cases unique, were so rare that only someone of the highest order of importance could ever have owned them.
This ends the section in the burial chamber space. Please leave the area by the way you came in, turning to your right, and move on to the next section, which is called Women in Anglo-Saxon Society.
Section 8, the High Hall exhibition, Feasting and the Roles of Women.
As we move around to this next area of the hall, we pass on our right a life-size backlit image of a woman in Anglo-Saxon dress. So far we have been hearing about a very male world of kingship, fighting and warfare. But that is just half the story. Can you tell us something about the women and their roles in Anglo-Saxon society, please, Sally?
Certainly. Women played an important role throughout Anglo-Saxon life, including end-of-life ceremonies and rituals. Freeborn women had much power and autonomy, as you will hear. Let's imagine the responsibilities they would have had while their men were away, likely for months at a time, trading, hunting or fighting. Then it's easy to understand that Anglo-Saxon women would need to have the skills and confidence to run not only their homes, but their estates and, in the case of royalty, their kingdoms. Men, for their part, would not have been able to travel to the Eastern Mediterranean or even farther if no one was left behind to maintain normal life. Now, we do know that buried in Mound 14 at Sutton Hoo was a very high status and important woman, and it is possible she was actually Radwald's queen. If it was her, she is unfortunately nameless in historical records, being referred to as that pagan queen. But we are told she was a formidable woman of power and influence, an astute politician and a protector of her people. Writing some 100 years after the royal burials at Sutton Hoo, the monk Bede tells us that King Radwald listened to his wife's advice and was guided by her values. She reminded him of his Germanic moral traditions of hospitality and kinship, dissuading him from betraying his guests for money. It appears Radwald's queen survived him. As queen, she would have had a major say in planning the king's funeral and the extravagant pagan rituals surrounding it. She would have received and hosted many dignitaries who would have come across the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to pay their respects. The image displayed here portrays a high-status woman whom we can imagine as our widowed queen. She holds an aurochs drinking horn beautifully decorated with gold, ready to welcome guests to the rituals. Her clothing, chatelaine belt and jewellery all announce that she is a person of authority. Such high-born women were valuable in Anglo-Saxon society. They played their part in political terms when alliances were being struck between kingdoms, but more than this, as educated people with their own personal wealth and trained in diplomatic skills, they were invaluable as support to their high-born husbands. Radwold's queen would have jewellery bestowed on her. As the gold-adorned lady of the mead hall, she would be the first to welcome guests, resplendent in fine robes, furs and jewellery. She reflected her husband's wealth, power and status. In his absence, she would need the skills to rule and make decisions, as all women did while their husbands and sons were away for months at a time, trading or fighting.
Thank you. To the left of the image of the Queen, there is a waist-height bench with 5 replica objects to study, which are all associated with feasting and celebration. So as we understand it, feasting with large numbers of people was not only part of the celebration of a life, but also a feature of the afterlife in Valhalla. These large cooking and drinking vessels show this king's wealth, generosity and power both in life and afterwards. Sally, is that correct?
Yes, all these grave goods are designed to show one man's wealth and power. This status would go with him to the next life. Celebrations on the same scale would have been held by the living at the time of his death to mark his passing and to make sure he would be remembered.
So although the replicas here are based on the objects discovered in the grave, they do give us a direct insight into the type of utensils for cooking, eating and drinking that would have been present in the great halls where these ceremonies took place.
Yes, that's right. For such an important king, the ceremonies and rituals would have been extravagant and prolonged.
The first item we come to at the end of the display bench is a vast copper alloy cooking cauldron, suspended by an ornate iron chain. It is 70 centimetre diameter and 35 centimetres deep, and could therefore contain around 120 litres of pottage or stew. Then beyond it are buckets, a dish and a drinking horn. How are these objects linked to the great ship burial, please?
The cauldron was found in the burial chamber complete with its ornate chain. The twisted iron decoration of the chain is reminiscent of the iron standard I described earlier. So these items were decorative as well as being functional, another example of their owner's status, wealth and importance. The cauldron's size indicates it would have been used to feed many people. The chain was 6 metres or 18 feet long and tells us something about the height of the hall needed to accommodate such a large vessel. Now that a great hall has recently been found at Rendlesham, we can imagine that it might have hung in there above a fire during feasts. Next on the bench are 2 large buckets. One is 23 centimetres in diameter and 24 centimetres high. The other 35 centimetres diameter and 35 centimetres high. They are both made from yew wood and have decorative iron strapping. They would have been used to hold water for washing and cooking. Beside the buckets, recessed into the bench surface, is a silver dish, approximately 22 centimetres in diameter. A Celtic-style cross decorates it across its centre. This replica is just one of 10 such dishes found in the burial chamber, which was stacked and placed at the right-hand side of the king's head, together with the 2 baptismal spoons mentioned earlier. As with the spoons, these are further evidence to support the claim that this is the burial ship of King Radwald. The final item on this bench is an aurochs drinking horn, the aurochs being a species of large cattle now extinct. It's nearly 1 metre from tip to rim, but is curved to appear around 70 centimetres wide in its display. It's decorated with fine Anglo-Saxon goldwork at both rim and tip, and was one of a pair found in the burial chamber.
Thank you, Sally. Now, next to this display bench, to the right, and on the outside wall of the hall, is a mannequin dressed in a high-status woman's robes showing the fine bronze enamelled brooch at the neck and the chatelaine at the waist. Do look closely, but please don't touch it, as it is alarmed to protect the garments and adornments. Please ask the guides if you would like to know more. Next we'll move on to music and gaming, which are also features of these gatherings, we understand. As you move around this section, further away from the entrance, there is a glass-fronted cabinet to your right containing a musical instrument. Sally, what do we know about this?
On the left-hand side of this case is an Anglo-Saxon lyre, a wooden instrument that the Museum of London Archaeology describes as the most important stringed instrument in the ancient world. To its right is a beaver skin bag for protecting it during transport. Normally, we wouldn't expect organic materials such as wood and leather to survive in the acidic soils found at Sutton Hoo, but luckily the lyre was placed in a bronze Coptic bowl, and because of the metal in the bowl, some fragments did survive. Although it was badly distorted with age and fragmentary, the British Museum reassembled it in the 1940s and realised it to be a lost musical instrument that history had forgotten. The Sutton Hoo lyre was the first of its type to be excavated, but luckily since then several others have been discovered in Germany and in Scandinavia, showing that lyres were in widespread use. The lyre is rectangular with rounded corners, 70 centimetres tall and 20 centimetres wide, and about 4 centimetres thick. It's made from maple wood. The bottom half of the body is carved out to form a resonant chamber with a thin sounding board closing it at the front. The top is an open frame with 6 tuning pegs along the top rail, and the strings strung vertically from them over a bridge and fastened at the base. It's played by plucking or strumming with one hand at the front while stopping the strings with the fingers of the other hand through the open frame from the back. This lyre was a finely decorated instrument, as evidenced by the gilded bronze bird-headed escutcheons that formed part of the attachment of the top rail to side arms of the body. A number of people around the world have made replicas of these lyres and have learned how to tune and play them. YouTube is a good place to go to hear what a lyre sounds like. Lyres would have been used to accompany stories and songs, telling the histories, myths and legends of the Anglo-Saxons, passing them down the generations. Meanwhile, at the gatherings, others would play board games, like the one behind you against the outside wall. It's a game called Nefertafel, for which the gaming pieces were found in the grave. This is a tactical game of attack and defence, and one of a number of board games played in Anglo-Saxon times. This is a hands-on exhibit for visitors to try out, so it's a good time to pause this guide and perhaps ask a guide to explain the rules, and have a go if you like.
So we've now seen the areas illustrating the Anglo-Saxon burial traditions and the way they celebrated the life of a great king, and also the importance of the Queen in the ceremonies. But what about other women in Anglo-Saxon society? What was their status, and is there any evidence of them at Sutton Hoo?
It's surprising to many visitors to discover that free-born women had more protection and rights than generations of women who followed them. Many Anglo-Saxon women were equals with their husbands, brothers and sons. A free woman was able to choose a husband and could still own land and property after marrying, giving her economic independence. In contrast, women in the later Middle Ages, or even in the 19th century, did not have the same freedom. Some women would have been healers with knowledge of herbs and spells, as well as being wives, mothers, and teachers to their children. As the managers of households, they would have overseen the storerooms, the slaves, and the complex procedures of cloth making. We do have evidence of another high-status woman buried at Sutton Hoo. The remains of a female cremation burial were found close to where we are standing now, when, in the year 2000, the site was being excavated prior to the construction of this hall.
So does this mean there's another burial ground at Sutton Hoo?
Yes, indeed. This was one of an earlier folk cemetery, dated to the late 6th century, and was a mixture of inhumations and cremations, including the one exhibited here. Ask one of the guides if you would like to hear more about the cemetery beneath your feet. The glass display case here on the left against the outside wall in the left-hand corner of the hall contains the actual artefacts from this woman's grave. This burial shows that animals were also cremated with the woman. The remains were then placed in 3 separate containers, but we have no clue to explain why this should have been done. One of these containers was the beautiful bronze bowl displayed at the left-hand end of the case, which contains some of the cremated bone protected from the acid soil by the metal of the bowl. On the wall above the display case, there are drawings of the items found within the same grave. In the display case next to the bronze bowl, there are a comb and a white bead, together with some small metal fragments. These are small, so do ask a guide about them if you wish. To the left of the case is another backlit image of a woman dressed in the Anglo-Saxon style. Her robes and head covering are undyed. She holds in one hand a white stone with a central hole in it. Here we have envisioned her as a wise woman, a healer and protector, who would use herbs and spells to cure illness and heal wounds in a world full of both natural and supernatural dangers. As a specialist in burial customs, she would also have played an important part when someone died. Such knowledge and importance would have raised her to a status warranting this quality of burial.
We're now going to move on from the wise woman to an area demonstrating not only the technical and creative skills of the Anglo-Saxons, but to the sources of the raw materials they used. As you move around, please take care, as there is a low-level table in the space here and some small chairs for young visitors who may wish to sit and colour in the printed sheets we have provided with designs from the ship burial. Now, to the right of the previous display, there are some brightly coloured textiles hanging against the end wall. Then to their right is a backlit, life-sized image of a young woman holding a drop spindle in one hand with some unspun wool tucked under her arm. Sally, what is this area about, please?
Well, although all the organic materials in the great ship burial had been lost due to the acidic soil, the archaeologists discovered the imprint of various materials between the bowls and other objects, showing that the grave goods included woven materials. This section talks about how those materials may have been made. This tool, made from a wooden stick with a weight, would have been used to spin wool fibres into yarn once the wool had been washed and combed. These spindles are portable and could be used at any spare moment. It was predominantly women who did the spinning, and the word spinster comes from this occupation. The finer the thread they produced, the greater their value. Girls, as young as 5, would also learn to spin wool. Some would have been slaves, as depicted here, taken in warfare or bought from traders, or even families perhaps facing starvation. Although slaves were at the lowest level of Anglo-Saxon society, People with skills, such as this slave girl, were valued, and being sold into slavery might have been her best option for survival and a reasonable life. The drop spindle is comprised of a disc a few centimetres in diameter with a hole in its centre, and through this a pointed stick about 30 centimetres long is attached with the pointed end protruding a few centimetres below. The disc is often made of bone, clay, antler or other material which provides the weight that will keep the momentum going once the spindle is set spinning. The spinster sets it in motion by spinning the pointed end anti-clockwise using thumb and fingertips. At the top end, a thin bundle of fibres from the prepared fleece is attached with a half hitch a few centimetres below the top of the stick. As the disc spins, it transfers twist to the fibres, creating a metre or so of single yarn. This is then wound onto the spindle and the process repeated to produce a long length of yarn. Yarn came mostly from sheep wool or linen. Linen derives from the flax plant. Its stem is soaked and pounded to release the fibres, which are then spun into a yarn, not too dissimilar to cotton. In this display, we have several examples of woven textiles. One is a design created by weaving different coloured yarns to make a beautiful geometric pattern. The others represent some of the textiles found in the Great Ship Burial. Overall, 27 different types of fabric were discovered. Looped pile cloaks, such as the yellow one displayed, cushions, wall hangings and rugs, together with furs, would all have gone into the burial chamber to make it as luxuriously comfortable as a king would expect. Dyes, such as weld or madder, would have been used to create these vibrant yellow and red textiles. Evidence from the Royal Hoo indicates just how fine some of them were. People able to spin and weave such fabrics were highly sought after and valuable to any household. One of the guides may be able to provide more detail about the weaving process. Or, if the textile team is working in the courtyard, they will be happy to tell you about the weaving and dyeing process.
Thank you, Sally. We are now going to move on to look at the other crafts that feature in this story and the makers of the fabulous objects unearthed in 1939.
Section 9, the High Hall Exhibition, Crafting the Gold, Garnets and Sword.
In this section we will explore the craft skills of the makers, the people that created the wonderful objects that were found in the Great Ship Burial. We will consider where in the world the materials and artefacts came from, and the techniques used to fabricate some of these exquisite objects. Continuing forward with the outer wall of the hall on our left, we now come to a freestanding, waist-high bench. We are now exactly halfway round the outer part of the high hall. There are 3 objects displayed on the bench. The first is in a display case. It is the major part of a beguiling, highly ornamented and majestic copper-coloured flat-based container which originally had a bucket-style handle to lift it by. It is quite intriguing. What can you tell us about this, Sally?
This is known as the Bromswell bucket, and it was discovered in Garden Field, the field immediately next to our High Hall and Visitor Centre. It was in 1986, during the time that the Tranmers were living at Sutton Hoo, that ploughing and harrowing brought pieces of the bucket to the surface. This field happens to fall into the parish of Bromswell, hence the name given to the bucket. We have on display in a glass case the major part of the original bucket, reconstructed from the pieces that were discovered. We also display next to the glass case a replica of the bucket for visitors to study more closely. The bucket is roughly 25 centimetres in diameter and 15 centimetres high, made of copper alloy. The outside is decorated using a punched technique and shows a scene of Nubian lion hunting. Only part of the frieze around the bucket remains, but it shows two naked male warriors with closely braided hair, facing in opposite directions and brandishing shields, swords, spears and arrows. One of them is accompanied by a dog, and they are attacking a lion which is rearing up against the warrior's shield. A griffin and other game animals also appear. A further shield is being held behind the lion, although we can no longer see any further part of the design. It has been interpreted to depict the story of Atalanta and Meleager, characters known in the Greek myths. The design is Eastern Mediterranean, and the bucket is believed to have come from Antioch, an ancient city in what is now Turkey, but then would have been part of the Byzantine Empire, and which was located close to the Silk Road and spice trading routes. Around the top of the frieze there is a Greek inscription which reads, "Use this in good health, Master Count, for many years." Many years is true, because the form of the letters indicate it was made in the early 6th century. We can only speculate about how it came to be here. No one knows for sure, but it was likely to have been around 100 years old by the time it got to Sutton Hoo.
It really is quite different in design from any of the other Anglo-Saxon objects we have been looking at so far. Again, we have this excellent replica next to the original, rebaited into the bench. Although it isn't a handling piece, the design is very clear, and it would obviously have been very valuable. Could it have been part of a burial mound or a grave?
We have no way of knowing. It may be safe to say such an exotic item was probably meant to accompany its owner on the journey to the next life. It was found in an area next to that earlier cemetery we talked about, so it is possible it was associated with a cremation or inhumation grave that had been ploughed out. We have an ongoing programme of geophysics here at Sutton Hoo, and we recently surveyed Garden Field again to try to understand more about its history. Although we can see there has been a lot of human activity in this area throughout history, it is difficult to interpret. But maybe in future we will learn a bit more. We do hope so.
Thank you, Sally. I can see one more item on this bench. It looks like a small gold coin about 2 centimetres in diameter and is displayed in its own glass case. What do we know about that?
You're right. It is a coin, and it was also found in Garden Field. It's Roman in design and honours the 5th century Roman Emperor Honorius. The obverse side shows his head in profile. The reverse side shows Honorius standing with one foot on a fallen victim and holding a Roman standard. The words victory and comob appear around the coin, the latter indicating the Byzantine mint and being short for Comitatus Obrisiacum. You may be aware that between the 5th to 7th centuries, the Anglo-Saxons did not use coinage in trading. A gold coin such as this was far more useful or valued as an object of beauty, so this one was made into a pendant.
I see. That's very interesting. Thank you, Sally. Looking inwards beyond this bench, there is a wall-mounted video screen showing maps, including Britain, Europe and beyond. There is also an audio track playing here of people recounting their journeys and trading experiences. So you may wish to pause the player here and listen to these accounts. But first, Sally, can you explain what this video screen is about?
Yes, indeed. This screen is intended to show the origin of some of the items found in the Great Ship Burial. It demonstrates the extent of trade and travel in the Anglo-Saxon period, as well as giving us further evidence of King Radwold's wealth and status. For example, one of the textiles discovered earlier may have come from the Eastern Mediterranean, and some of the garnets used to decorate many of the items buried in the ship appear to have come from India or Sri Lanka. That doesn't necessarily mean Anglo-Saxons travelled to these places. The Silk Road and the spice route were already established in the 7th century. Constantinople, Istanbul today, was an important trading hub. Goods from Britain, Europe, Asia and Africa were traded, including slaves from all those countries. Radwald's leather boots were lined, we think, with silk from China, for example. People, knowledge, world news and raw materials all changed hands in Constantinople. It was the internet of its time. This screen shows the origins of some of either the raw materials or the finished goods which were placed in the burial chamber of the great ship. We might say the Anglo-Saxons were citizens of the world, combining beautiful and exotic materials with imagination and great skill to produce rare items fit for a king. Please pause the player if you'd like to and listen to these people.
Thank you, Sally. Clearly, early Anglo-Saxon East Anglia remained well connected to the continent, and not only for goods, but also for ideas and technology which came into the country from overseas. No wonder some high-status Anglo-Saxon women had the education, authority and ability to run their homes, estates or kingdoms if men were travelling such distances for long periods to trade. We will now move on. You may have noticed a glass wall extension near this display bench. It has 2 wooden seats where you may wish to sit for a few moments before moving on. Please note that we do not allow any eating or drinking within this area or anywhere within the High Hall. The double glass doors here are the emergency fire exit. They are not an alternative exit from the hall. We now move on beyond the fire exit to the next corner of the High Hall. Set against the outer wall to our left is a waist-high bench and another activity centre for all ages. Set into the right-hand side of it are 2 metal plates. Each one has a raised relief design taken from the helmet. There are wax crayons and paper for visitors to make brass rubbings to take home with them. And there are more printed sheets and colouring pencils for young people to make their own images of objects from the burial chamber. We now turn our attention to the design and fabrication of some of the objects, the symbolism embodied in those designs, and the sheer magnificence of their execution by the Anglo-Saxon master craftsmen of the time. We will start with the great gold buckle and the designs incised into the front surface. We will get to the actual replica buckle in a little while, but first, above the activities area, is a video screen with magnified images of the buckle and colourful animations showing elements of the designs. Sally, please can you explain what is actually displayed here?
This screen shows a colour animation of the great buckle, magnified up to 8 times its actual size. The front face of the buckle is decorated with 13 creatures, all intertwined, and many biting the tails of the others. This animation cleverly picks out each creature in turn and shows how they all fit together into the overall design. There are snakes, eagles, dragons, and even a frog. Look for the frog if you can. You will have heard already of the importance of animal symbols in the Anglo-Saxon world. They would imagine the strength of the beasts depicted on the surface of the buckle being transferred to the wearer, giving protection in battle.
We will get to our replica of the real buckle in a moment. From this position, we need to turn around 180 degrees. In front of us now is another freestanding bench, the Maker's Bench, which contains a number of exhibits illustrating the craftsmanship of the Anglo-Saxons. Immediately ahead there is a horizontal light box with a framework on it and a number of different coloured shapes. I can see we are welcome to arrange the shapes to fit into the framework and to make our own patterns, but Sally, how does this fit the theme of craftsmen making objects?
Not only is this meant to be a fun activity, but it also tries to demonstrate the art of cloisonné. In this method, cells are made from raised metal to create walls, here illustrated by the fixed gold-coloured framework. Into this, the loose pieces representing gems, glass and metals are placed to create patterns or reliefs. In the case of the Sutton Hoo cloisonné, the cell walls are mostly gold, with garnet and glass used to fill them. The glass is in the style of millefiori, or thousand flowers. I'm sure one of the guides will be able to describe this technique if you ask. It originated in Venice. You might like to see how many variations you can make with the patterned shapes in our light box.
Now let's move round the maker's bench to the left. And here we will face a long rectangular glass case containing a number of objects, including the great gold buckle. Can you please tell us something about each one of these, Sally?
Of course. The originals of these spectacular replica pieces were all found in the burial chamber, and it seems they would have been worn at the time of the burial. At the top, running from end to end, is a textile belt created by tablet weaving. It is 5 centimetres wide and 1 metre long. The pattern is geometric, with intersecting diamond shapes along its length, picked out in blue, yellow, red and grey colours. At the right-hand end of it is the great gold buckle. The front surface is facing us and is decorated on its entire surface with those intertwined animal motifs. The gold buckle is 12 centimetres long, 6 centimetres wide and 2 centimetres deep, and it weighs 412.7 grams. It might look solid, but it's actually in 2 sections, rather like a hollow box. It has a hinged backplate and locking mechanism which would have securely gripped one end of the belt. The fastening for the other end of the belt is rather beak-like in appearance. When discovered in 1939, it was virtually undamaged. The fastenings and hinge still worked, and being of pure gold, emerged from the sandy soil gleaming as it did when first placed into the grave. This fabulous object again speaks of the outstanding skills in use at this point in history to make not merely functional objects, but items of great prowess and beauty.
Yes, this buckle is an amazing item and quite unique. What else can we see on the belt, please, Sally?
Towards the centre of the belt is an ornate purse. It's roughly kidney-shaped, 18 centimetres wide, 9 centimetres high, 2 to 3 centimetres thick. It is essentially a leather purse with a highly ornate cover made from a bone or ivory base over which a gold frame has been fitted. A straight bar with 3 small hinges has been soldered along the top edge. This allows the purse to be suspended from the belt by thin straps. Then, in the middle of the curved underside, a locking mechanism has been soldered. Within the gold frame, which has a 1 centimetre wide border of cloisonné gold, garnet and millefiori glass design, there are 7 decorative plaques, each no more than 2 to 3 centimetres on one side, but all intricately fabricated using the same cloisonné technique. At the centre are 2 mirror image designs of a bird with a highly stylised curved beak, similar to the one in the Great Shield, bearing down on its prey. To each side are what appear to be images of a man, flanked on either side by 2 wolf-like creatures. Above centre are 4 intertwined animals, reminiscent of the technique used to depict the boars in the shoulder clasps. On either side, at the top, are plaques of geometric designs executed in millimetre detail. When found in 1939, the organic body of the purse had rotted away, so it was only the gold frame and the decorative plaques that remained. So this replica is how we believe it would have appeared when placed in the grave of the king.
It's a very impressive piece, Sally. Was anything found in the purse, or was it empty and really just for display?
No, it was definitely functional. In the 1939 excavation, gold coins were found spilling over the frame from the inside, the organic leather and bone having perished. A replica set of these coins is displayed at the left-hand end of this case. Each coin is about 1 centimetre in diameter.
Gold coins, you say? Earlier, when we looked at the coin pendant, we understood that the Anglo-Saxons at this time did not use coinage. Where did these coins come from, and why would they have been included in the grave goods?
As we have already seen, the Anglo-Saxons were international traders. They loved bright, ornate items, as evidenced in their wealth, power and status. They also often displayed their international connection in the textiles, utensils and ornamentation they used. 37 gold coins were found in and close to the purse, together with 3 blank gold coins and 2 small ingots called billets. These coins were trimesis, small coins representing a third of the main unit of currency. They originated in Merovingian Gaul or France today. Close examination shows the coins were minted between 575 and 625 AD or CE. It appears they had been carefully chosen to make a sort of collection because each coin has come from a different Frankish mint. In 1939, coins like these from the early 7th century were considered rare in East Anglia. They were interpreted as a possible symbolic payment for the passage to the afterlife. The great ship needed 40 oarsmen. The 37 gold coins plus the 3 blanks made 40 coins. The 2 small billets suggested a payment for the steersman guiding the ship to the other side or the afterlife. Today, thinking has changed. More recent archaeology has unearthed more coins from this period, so it may be the gold trimesius and billets were simply another example of the wealth and power of the owner. You can decide for yourself.
That certainly gives us a lot to think about. Thank you, Sally. Now, moving to the small screen at the left-hand end of the maker's bench, what can we see here?
This short film shows the process involved in making the very ornate metal plates on the helmet. These are known as press blech plates. The plates were actually thin sheets of copper alloy, a few centimetres square, which were beaten onto a die carved with the desired pattern to produce a raised relief image in the plate. These would then have been tinned to produce a silvered effect when mounted onto the helmet, as shown in our replica here in the High Hall. Please ask one of the guides to describe the process to you if you would like more information.
Now we reach the end of the bench towards the centre of our hall, and another display case with some very small items in it. What's happening here, Sally?
This display attempts to show the cloisonné process and how it was used to create the objects such as those decorating the sword belt. Now we appreciate that this part of the display may be difficult for our visitors listening to this guide. The pieces are all millimetre, or in some cases sub-millimetre in size, but these are some of the pieces that our present-day craftsmen needed to make our replica items, and are therefore truly realistic for demonstrating the techniques and skills of the Anglo-Saxons 1400 years ago. I'll try to describe some of them for you. The raw materials are dark red uncut garnets, waffled or textured gold foil, gold wire, tiny splinters of garnet and rectangular gold boxes. The garnets are broken down until fine splinters or slices are produced, and these are shaped to exactly fit into the gold box structures that form the framework of the design. The textured gold foil is then laid in the gold boxes so that when a shaped piece of garnet is placed on top, it appears to sparkle and twinkle as the foil catches the light through the garnet, rather like a bike reflector. The gold wire is used to create the patterned walls of the box top and for other decoration. It's worth remembering all this was achieved without the benefit of spotlights, magnifying glasses or even spectacles. Incredible.
Yes, looking at these, it's easy for us to forget that the Anglo-Saxons did not have the modern technology we take for granted today. At this point in the outer wall of the central cylinder is the rear side of the display case holding the great helmet together with the shoulder clasps. This is the best viewpoint for visitors to see the press blech plates and the protective neck guard, and it is also an opportunity to see the shoulder clasps again and to note the stylistic similarities to the purse lid. Now we need to move around clockwise one more time to the long side of our maker's bench away from the outer wall. This is an open display illustrating the various stages involved in making an Anglo-Saxon sword blade. You may touch the steel elements here if you wish. So Sally, please tell us more.
This area explains how Radwald's sword was made using the method called pattern welding. The Anglo-Saxons knew how to work iron to make high-quality tools and weapons, and this is illustrated in this exhibit. The core of the sword was made by first fashioning a number of iron and steel strips into a square rod by forging and fire welding. Then, several of these rods, of now strong but flexible steel, were heated, twisted and fire welded together to form the core. The iron was not particularly pure, but the act of twisting and welding would have distributed the imperfections to eliminate weak points, resulting in a strong but flexible blade that would not shatter in combat. However, this steel was too soft to hold a cutting edge. Onto each side of this core, a harder, higher carbon steel edge was fire welded and then forged out and ground to create an edge that could maintain its sharpness. To achieve this demands an exceptionally high level of skill. We now understand the science behind it, but they would have just used the learned knowledge and experience of their craftsmen. The surface of the steel would have been etched with a natural acid to reveal the characteristic serpentine patterns that are aesthetically beautiful, but also reveal the underlying structure giving strength to the weapon. Finally, the hilt would be fitted, highly decorated with ivory and gold and garnet cloisonné attachments. Only a master craftsman could have produced such a weapon, and this may be further evidence of the importance of its owner, his wealth and power. The guides will be able to explain a little bit more about how this technology spread farther than the Anglo-Saxon world. The beautiful decoration, not only on the sword's hilt, but also on the other objects found in close proximity, further indicate the amazing technical skills of the time and the importance of their owner.
We have now come back full circle to weapons and warriors, and if we now continue to move around the high hall clockwise to the right of the maker's bench, we get to a chain mail tunic or mail coat that is displayed against the outside wall. It's surprising to see mail coats from this period. They often seem to be associated with the later medieval period with knights and jousting. It certainly has some weight to it. So what do we know about it, Sally? How was it made? And are we allowed to touch this?
Well, the original was badly corroded and fused when it was found in the burial chamber, together with an axe hammer. It had been folded and placed on the floor with another garment or skin placed over it. From what we have managed to work out, the mail coat was probably thigh length at least. It consists of finely forged iron links, each one 8 millimetres in diameter. Each alternate row is jointed and riveted using tiny copper rivets. It would probably have weighed as much as a small child and would have been strong and supple. It is rare for this period, but the technique has also been seen in face and neck guards from chieftains' graves in Sweden, as well as in the Coppergate helmet, an 8th century Anglo-Saxon helmet found in York. You are welcome to feel it and look closely at its construction. As with all the objects displayed in the hall, this is not a toy, and certainly not part of the dressing up kit, but perhaps lift a sleeve to feel its weight.
The mail coat is the last item from the great ship burial on display here today. Remember that we have only been able to share with you a selection of the most important items discovered in 1939 in this king's grave. Everything shows what a wealthy and powerful man he must have been. The evidence does seem to point to one particular person. The later state of the coins in the purse, the silver bowls and spoons, the size of the ship itself, the likely origin of the shield and helmet, and the location here at Sutton Hoo, the heart of the kingdom of the East Angles. When added to the growing evidence of Rendlesham as a high-status residence and the written record from the Venerable Bede, can we definitely say this is the burial site of King Radwold?
That's a question for people far more expert than me. You're right, though. There is so much that points towards this being Radwold's final resting place, but without incontrovertible evidence, we can never say for certain that it was him.
Thank you, Sally. Now, back at the Royal Burial Ground, Kevin told us about the other burial mound that had survived intact despite the efforts of the Tudor treasure seekers. Moving on clockwise will bring us to our last exhibit here in the High Hall, which is about that burial in Mound 17.
Section 10, the High Hall exhibition, the Horseman's display.
We have now moved to the large full-height glass display case set in the left-hand wall. What can you tell us about the contents of this case, please, Sally?
Everything here comes from the Mound 17 burial. These are the original items excavated in 1991 by Professor Martin Carver and his team and are on permanent loan to us from the British Museum. 2 graves were found side by side, covered by a single soil mound. In one grave was a rough oak coffin. Inside it were sufficient remains to identify a 25-year-old male. In this display case, there is a graphic behind on the wall showing the relative positions of the objects that were found, as if you were looking down on the grave from above. The actual finds are displayed in the 3D space in front of the relative positions of their discovery. There are key cards at the bottom of the case describing the individual pieces, but the text is quite small. However, we think this would be a really good time to ask one of the guides on duty near the entrance to point out and explain what's here. The items in here include a purse containing uncut garnets, a pattern-welded sword in its sheath, a sea axe, 2 spears and a belt with a cloisonné buckle. There are 4 clamps that held the coffin lid in place. There is the boss from a lime wood shield covered in hide that was placed on top of the coffin, and an antler bone comb. There were 2 spears and various containers for cooking that were placed beside the coffin, including the remains of some lamb chops. At the head end of the coffin was a collection of gilded metal shapes that looked like pieces of leather with rivets through them.
So was this also high status? The sword and buckle seem to indicate that from what we have learned so far. If this was on the Royal Who, was this also a young prince?
Well, that's less easy to determine, but the second grave in this mound shed a little more light as to status. Lying beside the young man was his horse, a 6-year-old stallion, approximately 14.5 hands tall. The collection of metal and leather turned out to be the horse's harness. This is displayed at the left-hand end of the case. The riveted leather harness is decorated at its major joints with several designs of gilded bronze plaques that include discs about 5 centimetres in diameter and slightly smaller, flat, bell-shaped pieces and narrow gilded strips. The harness would have made this an impressive creature as its owner rode into view. Perhaps the young man was a warrior of royal stock. We will never know for sure. It may be he had his stallion to convey him to the next world, rather than a ship, but he was certainly high-ranking.
You seem certain about the ages of both the young man and the horse. If the soil here is so acidic, how is it possible to determine the ages in this mound, but not in the great ship mound?
A number of factors may be at play here. Although mostly acidic, there may be seams of soil which are less acidic. Digging out the mounds may have mixed these seams together, altering general acidity. The graves may not have been at a uniform depth and therefore above the water table. Any of these factors could affect decomposition. No human remains were found in the ship burials, but sufficient skeletal remains were found in both the Mound 17 graves to carry out testing.
Thank you, Sally. The bench in front of the display case shows a short video of weaponry experts demonstrating how the weapons found in Mound 17 would have been used. There are also replicas of some of the weapons from this site, including a sword. Anglo-Saxon swords would have been on average 700 to 850 grams in weight and could have been up to almost a metre in length. A good sword would have been a costly item and would have been treasured by its owner. We have one sword in a mount which you can touch. See if you can lift the sword, hilt and tip, from its mount. You can only use one hand though. You would have needed the other hand for your shield, such as the one displayed here, or to control your horse.
And one final object before you go.
Positioned outside the Welcome Building is our intriguing scale model of the Sutton Hoo helmet, 1.8 metres tall, 1.2 metres wide and 1.6 metres deep, created in rusted steel evoking tanned leather or the colour of the wood in the ship, the colour of the last moments of sunset. The sculptor, Rick Kirby, designed the helmet to have a fiery presence, an icon of its age. The helmet is deliberately not complete, its pitted face and rough surface representing the age of the grave goods discovered 1,500 years after they were consigned into the memorial mound of an outstanding leader. It also offers a parallel to the remains of the helmet in the British Museum, a brown clay head emblazoned in part with the gold and garnet embellishments of the eyebrows, the nose, mouth and crest, and the distinct ornamentation on the rusted metalwork remains. We display this wonderful helmet in a slate frame matching the entrance and exit gates to the site.
That brings us to the end of our tour today. Thank you for visiting Sutton Hoo and listening to our audio guide.